Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my LPL Week 1 and Week 2 overview and analysis video. It only really made sense to combine these two into one video because Week 1 was only 3 days worth of games, and so didn't necessarily feel like it warranted its own video. But we're going to be going over everything that's happened so far at the start of the LPL Summer Split number 3, whatever you want to end up calling it. Of course, we are in a pretty interesting time for the LPL. A lot of teams are still making roster changes and decisions going into Split 3 and, kind of shuffling up everything that they want to do because they're not quite satisfied with where they finished. I think the LPL looked at their result at MSI and just generally what the domestic play was like and realized that a lot of these top tier teams need to find a different direction to go and if they really want to compete, not only domestically, but internationally as well. So we're going to be talking about all the shakeups, all the changes that happened pretty late into the offseason here, but of course talking about every single series that happened as well. If you are new here, what we're going to do here is go series by series, talking about the advantages and disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each series that we cover, and at the end of the week, I will be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We'll be looking at the standings at the end of this, the updated standings, kind of just seeing where teams lie very early on. As a reminder, we are separated into Group Ascend and Group Nirvana, but the groups are much more balanced than they were before, and I think generally you can find good teams in both categories, good and bad teams, quite frankly, in both Group Ascend and Group Nirvana, and I think that that was proven over the course of this time. Some upsets, some predictable results, some big matchups already, a lot to talk about here today, but before we get into that, yeah, I do need to promo at least a little bit. I am no longer a guest caster on LPL English because now I am an official caster on LPL English as a color commentator for the rest of Split number 3. Thank you guys for tuning in to those broadcasts. It really did mean a lot. I hope you guys enjoyed a lot of them, but I will be back for Split 3. I've already done my first cast of the Split. We'll be talking about the 2 series that I was lucky enough to be on cast for as we go throughout that, because I'll probably go a little bit less in depth on those because you can check out the VOD there for that, but also if you're watching this the day it comes out, this video that is, the day it comes out, I will be casting tonight. The 2 series that are coming up tonight, I will be on for LPL English, so be sure to stick around for that. And then, of course, I will also be casting on August 8th, the morning of August 8th. Those 2 series you can see up on your screen as well. So if you're interested, check it out. Links are in the description for both the YouTube and the Twitch. If you're not, that's fine. I'm still going to be making these weekly recaps for every single game, no matter what. But just wanted to self-promo that for at least a small second. But without further ado, let's get into the content itself. Like I said, we're going to be going series by series, and that means we kick off with the series that started it all, the first series of Split number 3. Certainly not the most climactic one, especially in terms of results. It was a Group Nirvana matchup between Ultra Prime and Edward Gaming, where Edward Gaming was very easily able to pick up the 2-0. This was not a very contentious series. Game 2 was an absolute stomp from EDG, and honestly, this is exactly how we wanted this team to look going into this split. Quite frankly, they underperformed throughout the beginning part of this year. I think we all looked at this roster and saw a borderline top 8, top 9 kind of team in the LPL, or at least I did. I looked at Xiaohao and Angel coming into the middle of the map, and On coming back, especially in the AD carry role, and quite frankly, that to me was a team that absolutely should have been competing right around where Thunder Talk and Ninjas in Pyjamas were, at least on paper. It just wasn't necessarily happening. It didn't really feel like a lot of these players were as motivated as they had been in the past, but leave it to the Summer King in Xiaohao to be able to step up when it matters the most. He always plays his best League of Legends at the end of the year. It's really funny how that ends up working out, but maybe a change in the support position was also needed because coming in for Wink, who obviously makes his way to JD Gaming, is Palkia coming into the support position, the EDG youth support that had gotten a bit of a runway at the beginning of this year to play for the youth team, had only really gotten a month or so to be able to play in the LDL and Asia Masters and all of that stuff, but there he was a pretty decent playmaker. His tape was pretty interesting, and already he's been thrust into action at the LPL level, and it's looking very, very good to start things out. He's actually player of the series for the first series here for Edward Gaming. Basically impossible to go in any other direction. He was the playmaker in both of these games. I think the Rel in game number 1 opened up everything that EDG wanted to do, even if you can give a lot of credit to the Varus and the Xinjiao as well for being able to push that. And then the Poppy in game number 2 was everything that this team needed it to be. Poppy is still incredibly broken. It's especially broken against bad teams. I think we've seen that pretty consistently throughout not only the LPL, but everywhere across the world. If you're not going into one of the best teams in the world, there aren't really a lot of teams out there that actively counter Poppy all that well. Like, they don't play into it all that consistently. And, we saw Palkia really take over in that second game. Really great stuff coming out from the rookie support. And honestly, that's really encouraging. We've seen a lot of supports be elevated from the LDL or, from even solo queue in the past. And, Palkia certainly doesn't have a ton of competitive experience, but we've seen pretty regularly in the LPL in particular, players with very little competitive experience are brought in, and yeah, maybe they struggle a bit at the start, but eventually they figure out how to get going here in the LPL. We saw it with Vampire, we're seeing it with someone like Sheer on FPX now. You know, these players that are plucked right out of solo queue, sometimes it takes a little bit of, you know, actual practice at the LPL level to get comfortable. Palkia is going to be at the very least not bottom 1 or bottom 2 in his first split, which he certainly wasn't in this first series. That's huge for EDG, and honestly, with the way Wink was playing and the way On and Wink in general were performing as a bot lane, it's not out of the question to say that this could be an upgrade, maybe not in terms of personnel, because I still really like Wink as a player, but in terms of output, because On maybe feels a bit more comfortable to play a bit more aggressive in this laning phase. So credit to Palkia, he was great in Series 1. I really do want to give a shout out to ZDZ as well. I've been very hard on ZDZ. I've basically completely given up on him as a player because I just have not been impressed with any of the gameplay that he has shown in the past couple of years. Quite frankly, I've never really been all that impressed with ZDZ. You can kind of check the logs of that in this channel's history, but the Renekton game in Game 2 was great. He was definitely better than Jung in this series, which, again, we'll talk about moving forward, but nice to see him at least have an okay performance. Xiao Hao was really good. You know, big surprise. This guy's probably going to stomp the summer split. It's just kind of generally what he does every year. He underperforms in spring and then does really well in summer. It feels like I'm repeating the points over and over again when it comes to him as a player every time I bring him up, but, you know, I have to talk about it because people seem to forget that that just kind of is the trajectory that he's always on. On was really good. Nice transition there. On was really solid in this series. He felt a lot more comfortable here. I think it was taking him some time to get back into LPL form after not being on a roster at the beginning of the year, coming back in for the spring split. He definitely felt a lot more comfortable, at least in this series, and Angel definitely looked good as well. EDG in general, just kind of solid across the board, and definitely looked like the better team, as they should in this matchup. And for Ultra Prime on the other side, you know, this wasn't a great showing. Like, you're not going to be super impressed here. I think there is some credence in keeping the roster. I know some Ultra Prime fans are very upset and frustrated that they didn't get really any new players coming in. Baya is starting in the AD carry role over Wako. That's kind of your big change that you're making going into the summer split, but I do kind of understand it because I think there is a core here that you can build off of, especially because this team really does value their own internal development. Saber is an internal promotion, Xiaoxia is an internal promotion, Baya is an internal promotion, so they really value having players come up through their own coaching staff and their own system and, you know, being able to put them into the LPL. It's not necessarily working just yet, but it's also just the first series, and EDG might be the best team in Group Nirvana, certainly going to be competing with the likes of Ninjas and Pyjamas and Thunder Talk, so I'm not going to freak out too much. Jung is unfortunately going to get my dud of the series, although this is really up for debate. It should be one of Jung, Baya, or Xiaoxia. All of them were really bad. Like, there's really not a lot to like in general about how Ultra Prime played, but Jung, to me, felt the worst. His Ambessa game, he got completely outplayed. He's a player that really needs to step up. I was high on him coming in to 2025. It's not replicated at the LPL stage what he was in the PCS, which was a very exciting, mechanically intensive player. This bot lane looked really bad in their debut performance, at least full time. Obviously, they got one game to play last split. This is really their first time playing on stage as a true duo, and did not work out well. They got completely gapped by On and Palkia on the other side. You've got Jun Hao in the jungle, who was the carry for this team in the previous split, but the jungle meta isn't quite as conducive to carry, you know, situations now as maybe it had been previously. Things like Neferi have been nerfed pretty heavily. You're not necessarily getting the same kind of carry junglers, and so, you know, the Wukong, the Vi, can he be as successful on those? We'll have to see. Saber is fine generally as a player, but certainly doesn't stand out in any meaningful way, at least at the moment. Ultra Prime definitely felt outclassed here, and I think that's mostly because EDG is one of the best teams in Group Nirvana. To me, there is a top 3 and a bottom 3 in Group Nirvana. EDG very much a part of that top 3, so it's no surprise they take the win here. Then moving on to our second series of the week here, and we go to Group Ascend for the first matchup in Group Ascend. It's Weibo Gaming taking on FunPlus Phoenix, and again, a pretty predictable outcome. Weibo Gaming is going to be able to pick up the 2-1 series win this time around. No real shock here, no real surprise. I think Weibo is looked at as the better team by a very large margin against FPX. I've gone as far as to say I think FPX would be pretty bottom of the barrel in Group Nirvana if they were down there. They're just lucky enough to still be in Group Ascend because of their playoff performance, at least last split. We'll see how they end up performing. We'll see how that ends up translating, at least to the rest of this year. There were some takeaways that were relatively positive for FPX, but Weibo Gaming was absolutely the better team, and it was in a couple of pretty key areas. So we'll go ahead and talk about it here. Xiaohu is going to get player of the series. This was not difficult for me. He was incredible in their 2 wins, the Oriana game in game 1, the Annie game in game number 3. Really the ones where he was able to gap not only Care, but basically the rest of FPX. I think specifically in that game number 1, he was able to stand out and really kind of push the team forward. Tien had a lot of really nice nice moments where he was able to pressure out a lot of what FPX wanted to do, especially going into something like Xin Zhao in game 1 or Viego in game 3, champions that really do like to skirmish and have pressure a lot in the early game. You got to give Tien a lot of credit for controlling space and not really allowing those engages to happen, but Xiaohu really was the one that was capitalizing on a lot of those, I guess, setups from Tien, and definitely was outplaying Care. So I will continue to be on the Xiaohu like bandwagon train. I was on it last split when I gave him an all-pro nod, and everybody was, freaking out at me, not only in the comments, but just generally in the community. And you know what? Like, I stick by it. I think Xiaohu was better last split than people give him credit for. It's a very weak mid lane class right now in the LPL outside of the top 1 or 2. Knight and Shanks are really good, and they're playing really well, but like, can you tell me that he's not the 3rd best mid laner in the LPL? There are so many players that are vying for that award right now that I think it's very likely and probable that Xiaohu's at the very least in the conversation for that throughout a lot of the split. Like I said, Tien I think played really well throughout this series. I think Breathe was better than his scoreline would indicate. Sheer actually had some really nice moments for FPX. He continues to be kind of the lone consistent bright spot on this team. We'll talk about the bot lane actually being pretty good for FPX, especially in their game 2 win, but Sheer was really the only one trying in their losses. The Aatrox in game 3 came pretty close to 1v9ing in that game. It just wasn't able to happen. Light and Crisp were fine. Crisp completely ran it down in game 2 on the Leona. You just kind of have to accept that. That's what you bring Crisp back for, is the fact that his good plays are incredible, his bad plays are terrible. The inconsistency is just what you're buying in for, because you want those high moments from Crisp. Sometimes he's going to give you bad ones like he did in game 2. Light also was not very good in game number 2. I think the scoreline is a little bit deceiving in that regard, but I think mid lane in particular was really strong. Jungle was particularly strong in this one, and that was more than enough to get Weibo across the finish line. And then for FPX on the other side, this roster is just not very good. Now, I will say Jue is playing for this team. That wasn't always going to be the case at the start of this year. I'm not going to delve into FPX drama, but if you're on Twitter, you understand that this org is kind of falling apart. They were placed Assume without the consent of a lot of the teammates and players of Assume, and they all got really upset. Shadow decided to leave, and so they're stuck bringing in a jungler who has basically no experience. Jue was trying to get out. He was, trying out for teams like JD Gaming and Bilibili in the offseason, or I guess in the split offseason. It just wasn't meant to be. He wasn't picked up by any of those teams, but he is still going to be playing for FPX, which is obviously a pretty huge positive for this organization. He is their best player, and we saw that in this series. Jiachi and Jue, I think, were both fine in this series. Quite frankly, they were good. Look at game number 2. Really positive performances coming out from those two players. The problem is the top side of the map, or I guess more specifically the middle of the map, is a disaster right now. IYY, which I guess is how you pronounce this jungler's name, was horrible. He's going to get dud of the series here. Even if I do think that Jiachi in game 3 was pretty terrible, on the Aphelios was probably the biggest issue. IYY definitely was in game 1, and he certainly wasn't like the biggest assist in game number 2. I think there's a lot of growing to do coming out of that jungle position. Like I said, with Tien, you see the experience difference when you watch Tien just bully this guy out of positions that he should be able to hold relatively efficiently, especially in game number 1 on the Xin Zhao, where he basically just ceded all pressure in the entire game. Really not ideal. It's also worth pointing out, Care was horrendous at the beginning of this series. If he wasn't a little bit better in games 2 and 3, like, he would have gotten dud of the series. Like, game 1, Care is probably the worst game anyone played in this series. That Talia was absolutely miserable coming out from him. There's nothing else to say about Care. He is an average, like a definition of league average mid laner at this level, and the problem is he's in Group Ascend, and he's only going up against, like, upper tier mid laners, which means he's going to look super below average in every matchup that he goes into. It just kind of is what it is for Care at this point. Sheer showed good things, I think, despite the scoreline. Jiachi and Jue, I think, had a couple of bright spots. I think generally that game number 2 was bot lane focused, which is really nice to see. There's something to build off of here for FPX, but again, the bones of this team are quite bad. I think that there really is a world where they're not even top, 10. You know what I mean? That's what I have them predicted as, number 12 in terms of my power rankings. I really don't think they're very good. I think they're probably worse than quite a few teams in Group Nirvana at the current moment, and, a win here kind of maybe shows me that that's a little bit wrong, but still a lot of growth and development to see from them. And for Weibo, obviously, you're expecting this team to figure it out pretty quickly. Crisp coming back in isn't quite the new roster addition that you would expect, considering how much time he's spent with so many players on this team. He's played with everybody here before, and so you would expect him to be able to come back in pretty seamlessly, but at least for now, if you can still play through the middle of the map, things are going to be just fine for Weibo. Then moving on to our third series to finish off our super day that started our split. It was the biggest matchup of the day between Invictus Gaming and Top Esports, two top 4 teams in my opinion, and Top Esports is going to come out on top. I know I've said that word already a ton, get used to it, in this matchup with a 2-1 series win. They just looked better, and I think part of that was Invictus still trying to figure out how they wanted to play the game. I think that there were a lot of moments throughout this where it was like, oh, IG are going to win this as long as they end up executing in the back half of this game. They've got Sejuani, they've got Victor, they've got Corki, and the Corki has a lot of gold, and you should be able to play through that. It just didn't really end up working out for them. I think a lot of, miscommunication, bad positioning in the back half of the game really ended up costing them, but for Top Esports, it just came down to them being a little bit more clinical. I don't think this was the best version of them that they wanted to put out there. I think with Sivir Akali, you also should probably be feeling good. Even Cassante, right? You should be feeling pretty good going into the later part of this game, but it ended up taking Gala really making some gigantic mistakes down the stretch in order for Top Esports to come out on top in this one. So we'll go ahead and talk about it here. First and foremost, the roster is a little bit different for IG. I did talk about this in the primer video. They brought Wei in as another jungler. Right now, Jeje is not in the country. He's not available to play games. He's with family. There's something going on outside of League of Legends. I don't know if Wei would be starting with or without that, but Wei is the starting jungler, and at least from what I've heard, this seems to be what they're going to do going forward. I would be surprised if Jeje ended up coming back in. There are pros and cons to Wei coming in over Jeje as a player. I think Jeje right now is better. I think he has been better for a little bit of time, and, I've been pretty vocal about that, but Wei has his own advantages. I think he is definitely more carry-oriented as a player, somebody who's much more willing to play aggressive in the mid game in order to try and push his team forward. He does like to scale, which I think could theoretically pair well with someone like Rookie, who's also a bit slower, at least in terms of where he's optimized his own gameplay, but Wei, definitely a different style from Jeje, and I could see a world where he comes in and is a bit of an upgrade, even if I think, on paper, I'm not the biggest fan of Wei in the entire world, as everybody who watches the channel knows. This series was not Wei's fault. I will say there were some problems in Game 3 on the Sejuani. We'll talk about that, but for the most part, he wasn't the issue on Invictus, and again, we will get into it. But for Top Esports, player of the series for me is going to be Jackie Love down in the bot lane. He was the most consistent force on Top Esports, even if it was, a little bit more back and forth than maybe you would want. His Xayah game in game number 1 was gorgeous. It really was the best game of the entire series. I'm pretty confidently saying that. I don't think anyone played a game quite as strong as Jackie Love's game number 1. I think his Sivir in game 3 was fine. He definitely was a big piece towards why Top Esports ended up doing well at the end of game 3. Would I say he was the biggest piece? Maybe not, but I think if you're looking at the series as a whole, it's clearly Jackie Love that was the one to kind of push the team forward. Hong was, ironically enough, the other player I really considered for player of the series here. I think he actually made a bunch of big plays here. The Rakan in game 1 was very good. The bot lane in general was terrific in game number 1, and I think the Nautilus in game 3 is going to go a bit under the radar for just how good he was. Cream ended up getting player of the game in game 3 on the broadcast, and I do kind of understand where they're coming from with that on the Akali, but to me, Hong's Nautilus definitely should have been in consideration for player of the game for that third one. So if he's going to be coming in, and he's not the Hong that we got on Weibo Gaming, he's much more aggressive, and is kind of back to the form that he was at on LNG, and that he was at, on FPX, and all of these other teams before, Weibo Gaming this year, then I think that's obviously going to be a huge positive. I really like the pairing of him and Jackie Love if they can get on the same page. Cream was important in Game 3 on the Akali, wasn't super relevant outside of that in this series, so I didn't really consider him for player of the series. Kanavi and 369 were obviously fine as well. Kanavi had some bad moments, especially on the Zed in Game 2, but for the most part, this was, overall a team effort for TES, and, I don't want to sit here and say it was good because there are a lot of things they still need to improve upon, but obviously they were good enough to be able to walk out with the win. And for Invictus on the other side, they probably should have won this series. They probably should have won Game 3. It just didn't end up working out that way. Gala was horrendous down the stretch in Game number 3, which is unfortunate because he was the one with all the gold on Corki in the bot lane. He's the one who's supposed to win you this game, and his mispositioning, his just lack of foresight, really ends up destroying Invictus's chances. He dies with flash up at the end of the game. It's really terrible stuff. Gala kind of has to be done to the series because of that, because genuinely, there's no other player that you can point out that caused IG to lose more than Gala. Hopefully he ends up figuring it out. It was just the first series of the year. I think in the other games he was fine. He was really good in game 2 on the Ezreal. I think that there was a ton to like about that one, but unfortunately he ends up selling it in game 3, and that is enough for me to give him dud of the series. Moments for Wei that were okay, especially on the Sejuani. I think the Wukong in game 1 was quite poor in terms of just being behind tempo. I'm going to give him some grace. I think he's going to be able to get back up to speed at some point. I just don't know if it's there right now. He seems to have much better synergy with Mako than he does with his former teammate in Gala. That I will promise you. Rookie was solid. I think Rookie actually was pretty good in this series, especially on the Talia in game number 2. He was really stable, never really made a ton of mistakes. The Shy had his own sets of problems, but was not the issue. Mako was making some big plays as a playmaker in this series, oftentimes was kind of paying the price for it with this team, you know, basically selling him at the end of that performance. But, you know, honestly, I'm not going to be mad at Mako. I think Gala ended up underperforming when it mattered, and I think Wei lost tempo in a couple of big moments. But overall, like, both of these teams have stuff they need to figure out. It's just that Top Esports was a little bit more prepared to win today, like on the day, and they're going to start 1-0. It's just the first matchup here. You've got a lot of time to be able to figure things out. But again, like, I don't want to sit here and say that either team looked great. Then moving on now to day number 2, and I guess technically the final day of week number 1. It was a matchup between ThunderTalk Gaming and Edward Gaming, kind of two of the top tier teams in Group Nirvana based on projections, and Edward Gaming, once again, going to blast their way to a 2-0 victory. This team looks incredible to start this split. Honestly, there's almost nothing to say majorly, like, negative about Edward Gaming in terms of their first 2 series. I get that it's not exactly the toughest of competition, but ThunderTalk was a top, 8 to 10 team for a majority of the beginning of the year. Obviously, they've gotten worse and worse, and they end up making a roster change in the jungle that I'm not even sure makes them better, but this is still a team that should be able to compete with EDG in terms of their expectations, and quite frankly, it just was not even remotely in the same ballpark in terms of how these two teams performed. And, there are a couple of players and just general roles in particular that we can talk about in that regard, but don't come crying to me in a couple of months when Xiaohao's in contention for being an all-pro and, starts really getting a lot of that buzz that he was getting the past couple of years again, because it's just what this guy does in the summer split. He's going to get player of the series here every single year, over and over again. Xiaohao ends up stepping up when it really matters the most in, split 3, summer, whatever the back half of the year ends up being. I see no reason to expect him to do anything else, because once again, we're seeing a lot of the great traits that we've seen out of him throughout other parts and other stops in his career. People talk about his time on Anyone's Legend like he was great potential that was never fulfilled. I think he was excellent for those teams, was really a 1v9 type of player that just never got the credit he deserved. A lot of people talk about players like Milky Way on FPX and on RNG as like mega stuck. That was Xiaohao way before Milky Way, and I just don't think he necessarily gets that same kind of reputation because he goes to Weibo last year and things don't really work out. He gets replaced by Tarzan, and Tarzan's better. Big shocker. Tarzan's maybe the best jungler in the world, and so you're not necessarily sitting here trying to compare him to, Tarzan, but then he goes to Rare Atom in the summer split and ends up being really good for that team, and people just kind of forget that this guy has consistently been really, really great for most of the teams he's played for, and he does ramp up as he plays more throughout the year. This was an excellent series from him. Again, he took advantage of Aki. Say what you will about Aki, at least he has like top tier experience. At least this is a guy who's played at a top tier level before, not in good form whatsoever, but Xiaohao was definitely better here and very much carried the series. Angel, On, ZDZ, even Palkia, all of them ended up playing really well here. Palkia was awesome in certain aspects of the game. I think his ability to buy space and really be the one to, full take aggro from ThunderTalk is really admirable considering what the team comp is for EDG. Did he sometimes go too far forward? Absolutely, but there are still a ton of awesome traits from him, and I really think he was a lot better than maybe even his scoreline would indicate in this series. On goes Deathless. It feels like he is back to being the kind of player that was at one point competing to be like a top 6-ish AD carry in the LPL. He's not been there super consistently, but there were, small stretches of time where he was performing incredibly. That's kind of what we're seeing here. Angel's kind of had a late career resurgence over the past couple of years. OMG, up and down moments there, but it was really the Ninjas in Pyjamas stop that gave me a lot of confidence that Angel can still be a carry at this level, and even ZDZ is winning pretty consistently on the top side, so EDG look very dangerous. We're going to get some more matchups with them later on in this week, but it's going to be really interesting to see if this team is just the best in Group Nirvana. If that's the case, there is a full open spot to potentially get into the playoffs from that position because of the teams near the bottom of Group Ascend. Really one team at the bottom of Group Ascend. So if EDG really are as good as they look right now, that's huge for them. And for ThunderTalk on the other side, the top side of this map is completely unplayable. And I think we're just learning that as we continue to go on more. Aki is coming in as the new starting jungler, taking over for Xiao Huangren. I think on paper, this is a side grade. Like, Aki is fine. Like, he's okay on tanks. He's pretty bad when he has to actually make any decisions for the team. In fact, he might even be getting worse on tanks. And, you know, that's kind of what we saw here. He's going to get done of the series. It looked like a disaster, but let's not pretend like Xiao Huangren was actually good or even solid for this team. He looked like the worst jungler in the LPL, or like one of the worst junglers in the LPL. So I'm not going to sit here and like tell you that this is a downgrade, because it's just hard for me to imagine going too much lower than that kind of performance. But Aki looks completely cooked. And honestly, even coming in for this first series, it did not look good. Coming off of a really bad stint with Ninjas and Pyjamas getting benched last year as well. It's just not a good look right now for Aki. But the solo laners are part of that as well. Like, they're absolutely horrendous. Satab is unplayable in the mid lane. This guy just continues to get run over. If he gets a lead early on in games, which is very rare, but if he does, he knows what to do with it. He knows how to play from ahead. Any other circumstance, he just cannot play the game. He's not going to be useful at all. Hoya, another player that just is not very good on the top side. Not much else to say there. 1xN and Feather, you know, they were fine, generally speaking, but I don't think they were as good as their opposition. Hard to be when the rest of your team is completely running it down. But Thundertalk honestly look like they're crashing back down to earth. This looks like the version of the team we thought we were getting at the beginning of the year. I think part of this is Beichuan just not being here anymore. He really was the glue for this team, the mental and the macro for what they were doing. With him gone, I just don't think they have the talent to be able to rise above their terrible decision making, and we're seeing that pretty constantly. And for Edward Gaming, again, if this is the best team in Group Nirvana, that's huge. The number one team from Group Nirvana, I'm not going to say it's like guaranteed to get into playoffs or anything like that, but they certainly have a better shot than most in terms of how things are set up right now, with FPX being a team that's in Group Ascend. It's very realistic for whoever is at the top of Group Nirvana to be a top 8 team, and right now, EDG are making a strong case for that. Then moving on to our final series of the technical week number 1, and it was a good one. It was Weibo Gaming taking on Top Esports, and Top Esports is once again going to pick up a hard-fought 2-1 series win. They can win these games. It just doesn't seem like they can ever really dominate them in the way that maybe we would want to see out of Top Esports, but getting victories is still big. They beat up on two pretty good teams here in Invictus and Weibo, two teams that are definitely fighting it out to be worlds, you know, caliber. You know, I was talking about them as the two teams fighting it out for that number 4 spot in my power rankings, and Top Esports, even if it was, you know, a little bit clumsy, was able to get across the finish line against both. I think obviously there was a lot on the line from a mental perspective for these two teams, because they did swap supports this offseason, with Hong going to TES, with Crisp going back to Weibo Gaming. It looks like Top Esports, at least for now, has won that trade, and I think for the most part, it's because of just how well Jackie Love is playing. He's going to get yet another player of the series. People are going to highlight that he won on Callista, which is obviously really fun and really cool. We're going to pretend like he's not been doing this all year long. Callista was pretty good until MSI. I get that MSI really tanked Callista's reputation, but that champion was successful before that tournament, and it will be successful after that tournament, as we can see here. You know, people really criticize Jackie Love for getting caught out and being too far forward and, you know, making some pretty critical errors. And while I do agree that that was more of a problem, especially in big moments in the playoffs for Top Esports than, you know, it needed to be or it should have been for a player of Jackie Love's caliber, I think the positives he added to the team got overshadowed last split, which I don't think is necessarily fair. This guy was still incredible in terms of his team fighting and his ability to play front to back. I still think that's where he thrives as a player. And oftentimes, again, as I talked about it last split, I think he's actually cleaned up on a lot of the weird team fight positioning mistakes. It's the out of team fight stuff, like walking around the map and, you know, taking a lot of these skirmish trades 2v2 in the back half of games that end up really costing him. It's very like Leave in nature. You know, I've talked about this with him as a player a lot, but Jackie Love started to adopt a lot of those characteristics at the beginning of this year. If he can weed those out, because he's still making a couple of those mistakes, like the core of Jackie Love is still very good and he's still in there, and he's already shown that through the first couple of series when they needed him the most. He's been the one to step up and really carry a lot of these games. It was the Callista in game number 3 that got them across the finish line. Hong, once again, continues to look really good on Top Esports, though. Don't color me surprised. I talked about this in the primer. I expected him to show up on this team and to look incredible and to really kind of showcase that a lot of the naysayers were talking, you know, kind of nonsense about him coming out of the previous split. I get that he didn't look very good. Weibo has a track record of making every support that plays for that organization randomly look bad, and generally Hong has been the most consistent support in the LPL. His highs aren't as high as other supports, but his lows are certainly not as low either. I was surprised to see how he played here. It's not shocking to see him get back into form. I thought he was definitely better than Crisp in this one, and it definitely looked like Top Esports won the trade. Cream obviously gets a lot of credit for the damage he's able to do, but man, those shockwaves in Game 3 were horrible. Like, oh my goodness, he does not look comfortable on Orianna. That's totally fine. We've seen him have a couple of good games on this champion in before. Cream is not playing up to his own standard right now. He really let his team down in the spring split. We'll see if that carries over into summer. He was awesome in winter. It's not just a 2025 thing, so we'll see how that ends up, translating. Kanavi was much more stable than TN on the other side, even if his highs weren't quite as there, and 369 was also fine. But this really is just yet another Jackie Love series in terms of being able to take over and carry. And again, I think the bot lane in general deserves a lot of praise for how they're playing right now. And for Weibo on the other side, it's the bot lane that really kind of sold it for this team, that really let the team down. We'll get to TN, who also had some really bad performances, just was way too deep at times, but also was the one kind of carrying them through in terms of the damage. But how can I not give Dud of the series to Light? The AD carry gap in this one was ginormous. Like, the actual individual player diff was huge between these two teams. It was really staggering watching Light feel like he has to try and trade 1-for-1 with Jackie Love and just not be able to do so because he's not quite as good as Jackie Love is. I don't know what happened to Light going into 2025, but this guy has not been even remotely the same player that he was, 2022 to 2024. That 3-year stretch of Light where he was genuinely one of the best and most consistent AD carries in the world, that's gone. That is just not here right now. I don't really know how to bring that back. I don't know how to fix it. It's just not happening. Like, the mechanics aren't there. The mentality's not there. He's not really winning in lane anymore. It just kind of feels like the worst version of him, which is never really ideal. Crisp had some problems in this series. I'm not going to pretend like he was perfect, especially in their losses, but generally you kind of know what you're getting out of Crisp. The player I compare him to the most is not the most favorable, at least if you follow this channel. But honestly, is there a huge difference between Crisp and Beryl in terms of how they play right now? I don't know. I think that that's a fair thing to point out. Crisp has been very good throughout a majority of this year for top esports. I think it just takes some time for him to get going. For Weibo, Xiaohu was arguably better than Cream throughout a lot of this series, just couldn't really do all that much. Tien was driving a lot of the action, was really the one pushing Weibo forward, but was also the one kind of holding them back in terms of their upside because of the bad plays he was taking as well. Breathe was whatever on the top side. Weibo kind of played as you would have expected in this series if you had watched them previously in the year. There were no real major surprises in terms of their form here. This is a team that should be losing to top esports as long as their, top is at least trying to play the game. The big problem for TES has been their own form of consistency. It feels like the bot lane is really starting to pick that up with Hong coming back in, Jackie Love getting back into form. If mid lane and jungle, top lane I'm not as worried about. If mid jungle can really start to get online and be that MVP, top 1, top 2 caliber mid jungle that we know they can be at a top end level, there's nothing stopping top esports from continuing to compete for the top of the standings and looking to go back and get a championship that they already got at the beginning of the year. Now we get to jump into week 2 proper, though, and this is the true week number 1, where most teams will be debuting for the first time. And kicking off week 2, it was a matchup between Ultra Prime and Thunder Talk Gaming. Of course, that kind of invalidates my point because both of these teams have already played technically in week number 1, but you understand what I'm trying to say. Thunder Talk picks up a 2-1 series win to kick off week number 2, and this is expected. As bad as Thunder Talk is, I think Ultra Prime has a very strong argument for being the worst team in the LPL at the current moment. I think on paper, you're expecting some sort of growth out of some of these players, again, just because the org has shown, hope in them to be able to figure it out in their own system, and you kind of have to match that hope just in terms of, getting something out of these players, but right now it's just not happening. I think a lot of the strides they took in the spring split have been matched by other teams, and they're kind of falling behind because of it. For Thunder Talk, they still have some talent on this team. It's just going to be difficult for them to get it out regularly against teams that are not, kind of a disaster like Ultra Prime is. You need to be at least so bad for Thunder Talk solo laners to be able to survive against you, and if they can do that, they can probably win. So obviously that's what ended up happening here, but let's talk about the bot lane because that really is the strength for Thunder Talk. 1XM is going to get player of the series here. 1XN can still win you games, and honestly, I'm really interested to watch him this split because throughout his career, we've kind of talked and I've pushed back on some of the hype on the channel. I think he's a very good player, like a solid one, a league average 80 carry in the LPL, which I don't think is the easiest thing in the world to accomplish, but I've kind of pushed back on this idea that I see top 5 upside out of a player like 1XN. I just don't know if he has that kind of skill set to ever be versatile enough to be like a top 5 80 carry for a top tier team that wants to try to push to make worlds. I just, that's kind of something I need to be proven on, and I think this is a big split for him in that regard because it's everything else is finally out of the way. Like all of the other carries that this team has had or all the other major pieces that this team has had, they're all gone. It really is just him at this point. You brought in Aki to play in the jungle, even Xiao Huangren, like at least he is a player that you're looking at and you're like, okay, well, he has some promise, some upside. Maybe you want to give him some resources and try to see what he is. Like Saytab is not that guy, Hoya is not that guy, and with Aki coming in, he is not that guy. 1XN couldn't really take over when Yucal was here because Yucal was also getting a lot of the attention and a lot of the resources, and so Now with 1xN really being the only player on this team that can win games for ThunderTalk, it's really going to be a test of like, okay, how much can this guy do when the weight of the world is on his shoulders? At least in this series, it looked pretty good. I think 1xN can definitely carry games if he's allowed to scale up. I think he's always been more proficient as a team fighter, but he is kind of a jack of all trades AD carry. He's a decent laner, especially when he plays those more early game champions. In this series, he opted obviously into things like Smolder and Aphelios and Senna that want to play for the late game. That's obviously not always going to work. I've criticized players in other regions for exclusively picking hyper carries because I think that playstyle is just inherently more exploitable unless you're by far better than everyone you're playing into. But at least for now, 1xN looking solid to start off the split. Very much going to keep an eye on him to see where he goes. Feather also, I'm much more bought into Feather's floor as a player. I think there is a world where Feather can still become a very talented and successful support in the LPL. And I think we saw here, I mean, massive support gap in terms of how things ended up breaking down for these two teams. The creation ability of Feather was so much higher than Xiaoxia on the other side. It's actually just not fair, right? Like the TT bot lane was so much better than Baya and Xiaoxia, which again, we will talk about as we continue to go along. Aki comes out here and has his best series that he's had in quite a long time. He wasn't playing like this on NIP, I can promise you that, but he had a couple of good games. I get that Junhao's not exactly lighting the world on fire. Ultra Prime, a pretty easy target to be critical of, but Aki actually was really good in this series, and I think specifically when you're looking at game number 2 on the Lee Sin, that's where he stepped up and really made a lot of impact happen for ThunderTalk. Hoya was really solid. Satab wasn't falling behind in the mid lane. Like, if your solo laners are surviving in your ThunderTalk, you're probably going to win the series, because that's just how it goes. Like, your solo laners are some of the worst in the entire league. If they are able to survive, if they are capable of going toe-to-toe with whoever they're going up against, then 1xN is definitely winning on the bot side. So, for ThunderTalk, they are who they are. I think they're probably around number 11 or number 12, maybe number 10 if they get really lucky, just depending on how things go, and this is the result that you would expect from that kind of team. But Ultra Prime might be the worst team in the LPL. They're certainly making a strong case for it at the start of the split here. Like I already said, Xiaoxia is going to get dud of the series here. Really not a lot else to say. He was just completely outclassed in this matchup. Like, Feather was doing a lot. The creation coming out from Nautilus and Renata and, like, all of those moments in the back half of this series. Like, the bot lane was super good for ThunderTalk. Xiaoxia was doing nothing, like, absolutely nothing in terms of how this series was going other than dying. The Rel was terrible. The Leona was terrible. It was just a really bad performance overall. He needs to get better. Again, he's one of these homegrown pieces that has come through the system that Ultra Prime clearly want to latch onto. He's going to have to start performing that like an LPL player, because right now it's just not really looking all that good. Jung and Saber also deserve all of the negativity that they're going to get, not just because they weren't very good in this series, Jung in particular having a very bad start to the split, but because Hoya and Satab outclassed you. Like, that is a disaster. That's bottom 1 in terms of how things are going with these two players, so not ideal. Baez had his own struggles coming in, even though he's really not the problem here. Junhao, I think, has had his struggles. He's certainly not been nearly as good as he was at the start of the spring split, or really throughout any of the spring split. Ultra Prime just look like a bad team at the moment. I'm not going to panic because they still have matchups against teams like LGD and LNG coming up, the other teams that I would consider in the bottom 3 in terms of how things are going. But if Ultra Prime are going to be a team that's getting destroyed by ThunderTalk and by LGD Gaming, like, that's a really bad place to sit, even in week number 1. So we need to start seeing some development for these players and, you know, from this team in general. And for ThunderTalk, it's a nice win, but how much does it really mean? Beating Ultra Prime is great. You already looked pretty bad earlier on in the week, so it's all about turning around that form and proving that you can get better with Aki getting more comfortable playing with the rest of the team. Again, eyes are all on the bot lane here because they are the pathway to victory. Then moving on to our second series here, and we get the debut of one team that I'm really looking forward to seeing more throughout a lot of this split. It was LNG Esports taking on Ninjas in Pyjamas, and let me tell you, I was not talking about LNG. It's NIP who picks up the 2-0 series win here, especially with LGD Gaming looking so good to start off the split. NIP, kind of the team we all expected to dominate Group Nirvana. They absolutely have the potential to do so, but, you know, if they're good and EDG are good, we could be looking at 2 teams that could make the playoffs out of Group Nirvana. I don't think it's all that crazy to say that that is on the table. Obviously, a lot would have to go right for quite a few teams in order to make that possible, but with the momentum that you'd be able to generate by beating up on these bad teams, maybe they just would be so confident going into those, you know, play-in series that they would be able to get the job done. For now, Ninjas in Pyjamas definitely working to show that they deserve to be considered the favorites in Group Nirvana regardless of how LGD Gaming are playing at the start of the split. And it's through a lot of their new players coming in, because let's be honest, this was a complete stomp. This was not not close under any circumstance. I think you can look at LNG and say, you know, there were moments like Zika's fine on the top side. He tried his best. He's a really good player, and on a good team, he'd be able to show that more regularly, but the rest of this team is a complete disaster, and we are seeing that in full force right now. Nio is actually going to be getting my player of the series here. Might not be the most popular opinion. Doingby is probably going to be the popular take here, and Doingby played great. I want to make that clear. Not trying to take anything away from him. I thought he was really, really strong for NIP, but I think Nio did so much of the work here for NIP in terms of the setup and just what he was capable of doing. If he can come in and just be the aggressive variant of what Ninjas in Pyjamas have been looking for out of that jungle position, obviously not getting with Aki and also not wanting to keep with Leon last year, if that's what Nio can come in and bring for this team, I think you could see some really big gains from Ninjas in Pyjamas, because really when you think about Doingby as a player and, you know, being somebody that wants to be the face of a franchise, what is his main trait? Well, his main ability and the main thing he's really good at is making his jungler look like $1 million. That's always been the thing that Doingby has really excelled in as a player, and I think Nio is much better at being able to receive a lot of those resources than most of the junglers that Doingby has played with over the course of the past few years, and it certainly feels like he's going to have better chemistry with Nio than he did with Aki earlier on in the year. So credit to Nio, he really was pushing the team forward. He was super aggressive, especially on the Lee Sin in game number 2. That's what I think I was most impressed by, was just his ability to continue to push forward, but the Vi in game 1 was also incredibly solid. Mega gap in the jungle here. Not that it's Xiaofang's problem, because, again, how much is he actually supposed to do in this series? But overall, Nio was infinitely better, and I think we're seeing why a team that has playoff aspirations, that theoretically thinks they could still make Worlds, why they would pick up Nio and feel comfortable going in that direction. But Doingby was also excellent. I have a feeling we're going to be seeing an even better version of Doingby than what we saw in the spring split, if almost entirely just because he now has a jungler he can play for, and I think that's almost always going to bring out the best version of him as a player. So excited to see the Sylas and the Twisted Fate, two of these champions that are much more skirmish-oriented, that want to get out on the map and move and want to play fast. Like, I'm really happy to see them succeed here for NIP. Leave and Niket look a lot better as a duo than Leave and PP God did. You know, I was pretty vocal on this channel about how I thought PP God was terrible in the spring split, about how I thought he was, you know, very quietly one of the worst players in all of Group Ascend over spring, and so for Niket to come in and I think upgrade this team is a big positive. Solo kill was solid on the top side. It looked pretty good for NIP in terms of their debut, but for LNG on the other side, this is the worst performance anyone has given so far in the LPL that we've talked about in this video. They were horrible in every aspect of the game. There was not a single redeeming quality for how LNG played here. I guess the only one is perhaps that Zika in the top side is fine. Like, he's an okay player. Again, he's really solid. He's just stuck on LNG, but everybody else here was a disaster, specifically the mid-jungle duo. Haichao's gonna get done of the series. Like, what do you even want me to say? This guy looked like he was an NPC out there, and I get that there are still some Haichao believers. I think I'm buying all out on the Haichao stock. I think he is a one-year wonder in 2024 for LGD. I think I didn't like him in 2023. I didn't like him in 2022. I'm not liking him in 2025. I think that's kind of what I'm learning from him as a player. He's just not capable of really stepping up, and it feels like his form has regressed to even being worse than what he was in those first couple of splits. Xiaofang coming in hopefully can rebound from this. He was supposed to bring a lot of energy and action to LNG. He did make them better at the end of the split last in spring, but man, it did not show up here. He was playing carries, too. He was playing things that he needed to be aggressive on, and boy, did the Nefiri look terrible in game number 2. LP is a huge question mark. This guy is just kind of nothing as an AD carry. He's below average in terms of mechanics and doesn't really have a killer instinct. I don't really know what he offers. He's not photic, which I think is a good thing, but he's not good. And Zhuo, like, it's not like he can really do anything in the support position to be able to salvage this either. LNG is just a bad team, and honestly, I might have even been overrating them, putting them at number 11. They might be even lower than that. A bottom 3 team in the LPL until proven otherwise. And for NIP, it's a big win. But really, the question is not can you beat the bottom 3 teams in Group Nirvana? It's can you compete with the other top 2 teams in Group Nirvana in Thunder Talk and obviously LGD Gaming. If you're going to be able to do that, then this is a team that absolutely can not just make playoffs, but maybe make some noise there as well. Then moving on now to day number 2 of week number 2, and this was the day that I casted across week 2, so I might be a little bit quicker on the overview for the series, but kicking it off is a matchup between LGD Gaming and Ninjas in Pyjamas. We're going right back to the well, and we're going right back to talking about an NIP win here because they pick up the 2-1 series victory against LGD. No real surprise in terms of the outcome here. Credit to LGD for picking up game number 2. After game 1, it really felt like it was going to be dead in the water, but they stayed alive, they stayed focused in terms of how they wanted to play in and they came back and won that second game. Sasa was a monster in this series on the top side for LGD. It just did not matter. The rest of this team was kind of disastrous in a lot of key areas, and that ended up being the problem. For NIP, they were better for the most part, especially early on in these games. They were really dominant in the laning phase and carried that into a lot of the late game team fights. Were there things they needed to clean up? Yes, but for the most part, it was still pretty darn good. Nio is once again going to get my player of the series. I really do think he's reinvigorated how this team plays the map, and I think it's hard to look at anything other than the Viego game in game number 3 and see a player of the series. It's just kind of how it goes when you go 11-1 and 11 on Viego and carry the game and really dominate in the way that he did. That's player of the series worthy, especially going into your former team with all of the narrative on the line, all of the storylines on the line. That was a really big outcome overall for Nio, and so I'm happy to see him step up and look so good at the start of his tenure here for Ninjas in Pyjamas. I think it will continue. You know, I expect him to be a big positive for this team. This was a guy who was an LDL MVP for Top Esports before he got picked up and kind of run into the ground by Rare Adam last year. He got a new lease on life in the LPL with LGD, and he's made the most of it now, potentially pushing his way back into a playoff caliber form. Credit to Leave. He's the other player I considered here. You know, we're going to get into it. The bot lane 2v2 was so in favor of NIP. It was actually ridiculous. Leave and Niket just completely obliterated Savior and YCX. It was not even a conversation. It was not remotely close, especially early on in the 2v2. Leave had a couple of mistakes down the stretch, but Niket in particular was outstanding for NIP. He was honestly on the table for me for player of the series. I really think he wasn't getting enough credit, even by me and the, you know, general broadcast, like for, you know, how well he was playing. I think he was excellent for NIP, especially going back and rewatching the tape. Leave, you know, was a huge carry in game number 1, got mega fed on the Varus and took over from there. Obviously gets another 2v2 kill in game 3 on the Sivir going into Draven. Never a good sign for the Draven to lose that 2v2 matchup, but it kind of is what it is. Doingby continues to be fine for this team in the mid lane, made a lot of proactive plays, and solo kill was generally really strong as well. Overall, it's just another good showing for NIP. You could have wanted a bit more from them in game 2, especially from Leave, who I don't think was perfect. Even Doingby wasn't perfect in game number 2, but I think overall those are nitpicks. They were the better team, especially in their wins. And for LGD on the other side, this team is just kind of bad. I think we expected this. I put them last in my power rankings because I honestly thought they would regress quite a bit from what they were in the spring split. They were still able to pick up a win off the back of Sasa, who was incredible in this series. He was awesome on the Rumble in game 2, clearly the player of the game there. And then honestly tried to 1v9 as much as he possibly could on the Jax in game number 3, was actively 1v5ing fights for large sections of time. It just didn't end up mattering. There wasn't enough to do for Sasa to be able to carry. Everybody else really let the team down. Climber and XQW were both quite poor, but it was hard for me to give dead of the series to anybody that wasn't XQW with just how he played the beginning part here. The Ahri was obviously getting caught out a ton in game number 3 for being too far forward, but it was the Talia that was truly atrocious in game number 1 and really is the big reason he's getting dead of the series. Savior and YCX kind of deserve to be lumped in there. Savior had a good smolder game in game 2, and that's kind of what keeps him out of it. YCX was terrible in lane throughout this entire series, and if that's going to be his thing, if he's just not going to be good enough in the 2v2, that could really hold him back. I think he has some nice playmaking instincts, and I do like Savior as a player. I think there's something to unlock there as a duo, but it was not there in this series. Climber obviously getting his first real shot as the starting jungler here with Nio, moving over to NIP, facing his former, teammate, the player that replaced him last split, and getting, kind of obliterated by him. It's not really the best look, but again, you're not surprised by the fact that LGD lost to NIP. You're not really shocked by that outcome. So overall, nothing too scary here. Obviously, the game 2 win is pretty nice, but NIP continuing to look strong, and it's really going to be them and EDG at the top of Group Nirvana, kind of determining who ends up fighting for that #1 spot. Then moving on to the second series of day 2, and the second series I cast this week, it was Team WE making their split debut against Invictus Gaming, and IG is able to pick up the 2-0 series win, just like they were capable of doing in the playoffs. Against WE, they end up shutting out the upstart young overperformers so far. It's not a great start to the split for WE. I think there's some positives and some negatives to take away from this series for them. I think that there were some good performances, but really, at the end of the day, IG was better in almost every aspect of the game, and specifically Rookie just had an unbelievable performance, and that is the big takeaway, at least for me here, is that Rookie was so good for IG. He's going to get player of the series here. The Talia in game #1 was massive, but it really was the Aurora in game #2 that shut out the door for WE to be able to come back in this series. It was just a classic Rookie performance, and you know what? We've been waiting on him to have these kinds of performances all year long. I know a lot of other analysts have been a bit higher on what Rookie has been so far in 2025, but I have not been one of them. them. I've not been one of the people that's really been going to bat for Rookie. I think he's been fine. There have been times where he's been good, times where he's not been so good, but I've been on record saying that I think his 2025 has been a lot closer to what his 2023 was on Top Esports as opposed to what his 2024 was on Ninjas in Pyjamas. So, you know, I am a bit concerned about whether or not Rookie can be the #1 option for a team that's trying to make Worlds. But if he's going to play like this, if he's going to go up against WE, who has proven themselves to at the very least be competent and decimate them individually, then yeah, I think he deserves to get all the credit and all the praise he absolutely deserves. It wasn't just him, though. I think Wei has started to get more comfortable. The Poppy game, I could take or leave in game #1. Quite a few mistakes coming in from him on the Poppy, but the Xin Zhao in game 2 was much better. Gala was really solid in this series. I don't think he's going to get enough credit for how good he was in game #2 on the Varus. I thought he was really solid there. Mako feels a lot more comfortable playing with Wei than he did with Jejet. Now, I'm not saying that that makes Wei the better jungler for this team. I'm more so just saying that Mako in particular definitely is looking better here than he did in the spring split, and the Shy was also the better top laner by a lot. When you isolate the Shy versus Cube in a 1v1 matchup, the Shy is going to generate a pretty large lead in that particular matchup. So overall, really nice overall game plan and just execution from IG. They were better here today, mostly through Rookie in the mid lane. And then for WE on the other side, it was kind of a lot of pieces falling apart for this team. I think there was a lot of disconnect. I don't think they played their comps particularly well. I think they drafted some pretty difficult to execute options, but it just didn't really end up working out for them. Karis is going to get dead of the series here. This was not difficult for me. He was not only pretty bad in game #1 on the Orianna, where he was actively missing shockwaves after generating a giant early lead, but in game #2, that Akali was the opposite of being a nightmare for any AD carry in the game. That thing was tickling by the end of this game. The Akali was completely non-existent. I think the gigantic gap in the mid lane here was probably the biggest difference maker in favor of IG. I think you're looking at Cube having a really tough time on the top side, although part of that I'm going to give him some grace for because he was left on an island against the Shy with Wei putting pressure onto the top side, and he kind of just had to survive. But that Gwen game in game #1 was truly horrific. He was completely isolated and was entirely useless down the stretch in that game. Vampire was going in without the rest of his team, especially in that second game. He was just playing way too fast, not really playing on any sort of like proper timer for the team. Taeyun really never got a chance to play. Monkey was generally fine, was definitely the best performing member of WE as he has been throughout the entire year, but this wasn't really a great performance from WE. This doesn't give me a lot of confidence that, you know, they're going to be able to replicate what they were in spring moving into summer. I think there is reason to believe that they're going to regress, even if the regression is, you know, much better still than what we expected out of them at the beginning of the year. You know, they're a bottom 2 Group Ascend team until proven otherwise. Obviously, there are teams there that they beat in the playoffs, like Top Esports, like JD Gaming, but, you know, I think we're projecting those teams to be able to figure it out and to step up. WE might just be a team that goes back to being somewhere in the middle of what they were at the beginning of the year and what they were last split, and that's going to be a team that needs to fight for being top 8, that probably needs to fight to potentially go up against an Edward Gaming or a Ninjas in Pyjamas for a playoff spot. That's not guaranteed to WE, so we still need to see some, you know, improvement that stays linear. We need to see this team continue to get better, but for IG, this is a pretty good way to really cap off what you are at the start of this split. I think if Wei is going to be the full-time starter, which again, we don't really know. Jeja's got off the Rift issues and things with family and mental health and all of that. I don't really know what the plan is for Invictus Gaming moving forward, but if it is going to be Wei, it's clear that that helps Rookie, at least in the short term. He's been playing a lot better, and it definitely helps Mako to be a lot more proactive on the map. You know, it could be an upgrade for IG, even if the individual player himself is not an upgrade in my opinion. Right now, this team actually looks pretty darn good. Then moving on now to day number 3, and we kicked off day 3 with a matchup between FunPlus Phoenix and Top Esports, where TES are going to pick up the 2-0 series win. Obviously, congrats to Top Esports. This is a win they absolutely should be picking up. They finally have a 2-0 to hang their hat on, but it's a 3-0 start for TES, which is a pretty damn good place to be, all things considered. You know, I know that their beginning part of the schedule wasn't as hard as some other teams. They don't have to face either of the top 2, but they did have to face IG and Weibo Gaming. I get FPX is a bit more of a cakewalk, but this team has kind of been tested already, at least a little bit to start the split, and they've shown that, yeah, we were, you know, out of our own element in the playoffs. That was not who Top Esports truly is. This is a team that's getting better and getting back into form going into summer, which I think is encouraging. For FPX, they're the worst team in Group Ascend. It's not particularly close. They don't even really put up a fight in this series. Again, there are some takeaways from an individual player perspective that you can be at least a little bit okay with, but from an overall perspective, it's just kind of a nightmare for FPX. So Let's talk about it here. Player of the series for me is going to go to Cream in the mid lane. I thought he was the most relevant, especially on the Akali in game number 2. Really awesome game from him. I get that it's one of his signature champions, but again, I always say this with players like Zeka and Cream and all of these players that get this, like, oh, small champion pool tag, put on them. I get that we're now in Fearless, which is definitely a little bit more difficult, but when you have, 7 or 8 champions that are your, core champions, you can't just take away all of those champs. Like, it's not possible. Even if you spent all 5 of your bans on Cream, which you're never going to do, and even if you're in game 3 of a series, he's still going to have options to be able to play out in the regular season here, and I think we continue to see that. He is really, really good, and I think he's more versatile than he gets credit for. Hopefully he's starting to get back into form. He's been pretty good to start off the split. There have been some problems, obviously some Orianna shockwaves that have gone awry, but at the end of the day, if he's going to be more aggressive, and if he's going to be able to generate the resources he's been able to generate so far, that's already a big enough positive for me to see, like, okay, in a weaker mid lane class, could he be top 3? Absolutely. He still has that kind of talent. Credit to Kanavi, he somehow, some way ends up with a Trundle pentakill. I didn't think that that was going to be possible in professional play, but here we are. Obviously, he did a good job to be able to set up these plays. He was not the carry in this series or anything like that, but definitely deserves a shout out. I mean, going into IYY, who is a disaster, he does not look good enough to be playing in the LPL at the current moment. Kanavi definitely, kind of proving that, but still, pentakill on Trundle, definitely worth noting. Jackie Love and Hong are clicking. Like, this bot lane duo is working, and working really well. I'm actually really excited to see this moving forward, because right now both of them are playing incredibly aggressive, and I think that it's just working out for Top Esports. The resources that they're able to generate, very similar to what I said about Cream in the mid lane, it's just ridiculous, except Jackie Love's not throwing it away in the back half of the game. Hong is playing like a psychopath on Karma in game number 2, and he's never really getting punished for it because the rest of the team is following up with his aggressive tendencies. It's a really good look for the bot lane, and honestly, if there is a lane right now that has been impressive to me at the start of this split, it's probably Top Esports bot lane. Like, they really have been that good. 3 series and 3 series in a row now where they have dominated. So happy about Jackie Love and Hong. Jackie Love's, going to be on MVP pace through week number 1, I promise you that. 369 was definitely better than Sheer on the other side, but overall, this is just the most clean win that Top Esports has gotten so far this week, and that's a 3-0 start for them, which is pretty damn good. And then for FPX on the other side, not really a lot to talk about when it comes to this team, to be entirely frank. I wish I had more to say, but Jiachi and Jue in the bot lane, they're fine. Like, they can do some things. Jiachi is, I think, playable in certain situations. Like, he's not overly aggressive, but his mechanics are pretty solid from a baseline level. I don't think he's a superstar. Do I think he offers a bit more than what Assume offered? Yes. I do think he's a bit more stable than Assume, which I think is generally good for this team. But if Jue can't step up and be this big playmaking support, if you have someone like Hong on the other side of this who's going to play so crazy and is going to generate so many resources for Top Esports, you're probably not going to win as FPX. Very similar to what we've said about, like, 1xn and Feather for Thunder Talk. If you don't have those players in particular stepping up, it's really hard to imagine a world where this team ends up figuring it out, because Care is just not going to be able to go up against a lot of the mid laners in Group Ascend all that consistently. He had another series where back and forth, right? Like, I'm glad he was able to generate resources, but capitalizing on it was a different story. IYY was okay in game number 1 on the Wukong, was awful in game 2 on the Nocturne. I do not want to see him play Nocturne again. That's just too difficult, clearly, for FPX to be able to execute on. And then Sheer's gonna get my dud of the series. What did this guy even do in this series? I love Sheer, and I know that this is a bit of like, oh, we played top lane and lost, and so it ends up looking kind of bad, but he wasn't good in lane, he wasn't good out of lane. The Cassante didn't really make an impact, the Rumble certainly didn't make an impact in game number 2. It just never really felt like he was involved in anything that happened, and at least IYY and Care had moments where they were trying to do things. You had game 1 for IYY, and you had game 2 for Care, where they were attempting to try and play the game, but Sheer just didn't have any of that, in my opinion, on the top side. I just don't feel very good about FPX. I think even with Jue in here, you're still looking at not only clearly the worst team in Group Ascend, but likely a team that's worse than the top 3 teams in Group Nirvana at the current moment, which is just never a great place to land in. So FPX, they need to figure it out. They need to, level up as we go throughout the rest of this week. And for Top Esports, 3-0 is a great start, but it's already not even done yet. You still have to play more games this week, which is just absolutely ridiculous, jam-packed at the start of the split. But, this team looks pretty good, at least to start off summer, and I think we still have a contender to potentially win the entire league on our hands. Then moving on to our second series of day number 3, and a predictable outcome here, Weibo Gaming taking on Team WE, and Weibo Gaming is going to pick up the 2-1 series win. Unfortunately for WE, man, this is just not the same team that we saw throughout a lot of the last split. This is unfortunately a lot closer to what we saw at the beginning of last split, where they miracled their way into Group Ascend because of, you know, some pretty poor performances from Ultra Prime down the stretch of the qualification series. They end up going like 0-8, I think, or something like that to start Group Ascend. They go on a massive run, beating some of the best teams, and obviously from there, you started to look at them as a true contender when they get 4th in the playoffs. But, you know, this is more the version of them that we have seen for most of the year. It feels like, again, the clock struck midnight, like they are coming back down to earth in terms of how things are going. I hope that's not the case. I hope they figure some of their problems out, but man, some of the individual performances have really regressed back to the mean, which we will talk about. But for Weibo, it's a nice win. Again, I wish this team was flashier. I wish they were a bit sexier in terms of their gameplay and performances, but honestly, they're just a team that does a lot of the little things very poorly, and then they go and win the game anyways. Like, it's just kind of who Weibo is. You got to learn that that's just what they're going to offer as a team. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series, at least for me, this was one of the more difficult ones so far this week, but I'm going to give it to Breathe in the top lane. I feel like it should be Breathe or Light. You know, Tien was in the conversation for me as well. I think all 3 of them ended up playing really well, but Breathe, I think, was the one who took advantage of his laner the most. Cube on Aurora, not it. Like, that's not the vibe for me. I've never liked Cube on carries, even in his prime when he was playing for Rare Atom and, you know, was actually a very valuable top laner. You know, he wasn't good at carries then. He's not good at carries now. I just don't really want to see it out of him. Breathe gets to play Mbessa in game number 2 and completely destroy the late game. He gets to play Cassante in game number 3 and basically do the exact same thing, except on a champion that scales even better into the late game. It's just not a good look for Cube, and Breathe honestly kind of, you know, bouncing back. I know some people were more critical of his playoff performances, but I've always been a fan of what Breathe has offered. I've never considered him elite as a top laner. I think it would take a lot for me to consider him elite as a top laner at this point in his career, but he's definitely that, you know, echelon right below elite. Like, he's your B+ caliber, really good top laner at the LPL level, and he can still take advantage of really good matchups. Light was awesome in game 3 on the Sivir, really was the out, like the win condition. I think that was juxtaposed even more by the fact that Taeyun was so bad on the other side on the Smolder. Like, it really was more obvious that Light was just kind of doing his job, but I called earlier in the video for Light to step up, for him to be the guy that could really be 2022, 2023 Light, rather than what we had seen from him so far in 2025, because it really has not looked all that good this year. This was much closer to what you expect out of Light. No flashy gameplay, no crazy big plays, but just really stable damage coming out of the bot lane. That's what you want out of him. That's his role. That's his job. Tien was really nice this series. I thought, you know, Monkey tried his absolute best to 1v9 throughout a lot of these games. Tien was doing a good job keeping up tempo and pressure with him, even if he wasn't getting the same kind of resources. Xiaohu in the mid lane also as well, just better than Karis on the other side. That's not particularly surprising when Karis has to do really anything for this team besides play control mages. It ends up being a bit of a disaster. We'll talk about that a bit more when we get to WE, but overall, it's a nice win for Weibo, even if I don't think the focus in this series was much on Weibo Gaming. I think it really was on WE and their lack of production, and quite frankly, their misplays down the stretch. Taeyun is obviously dud of the series. I don't think I really need to explain that to you. This Smolder game was just not good enough in game number 3. Really, he wasn't good enough in game 2 either. I hate to say it, but like, this is the Taeyun that we saw for many, many years in the LCK and in the LCK Challengers League, and throughout a lot of his time over in Korea. He was a player that could just not get it done in big moments, would make gigantic mistakes, would step too far forward, would not really be cognizant of the setup around him, and quite frankly, WE had pretty good setup in this series. Monkey in particular was awesome here. Vampire had a couple of nice engages, but generally they were disconnected from the rest of the team. Taeyun was just doing nothing. Like, it didn't matter how much setup he had. He was never going to be able to fulfill that, and that was the problem I had with him on KDF back in the day. And so, you know, I am concerned that that is kind of the real Taeyun, and that the flashes that we saw in spring are just flashes. We've seen so many players be one-split wonders here in the LPL. You have to hope that Taeyun's not going to be that, but certainly didn't encourage me in terms of this series. Karis continues to also just be a problem. This guy has been given so many chances in top-level games. Like, I don't know what else we're waiting to see. Like, he continues to pick things like a Kali and Silas over and over again. Put this guy on control mages, let him go neutral in lane, and hope he doesn't run it down in teamfights. That is the recipe for success with Karis as a player. I just don't trust him as an assassin player. Vampire had a couple of nice engages, but again, some were just over-eager, and he does feel like he's playing a bit too fast. I would love for him to slow down just a little bit to play with the rest of this team, because I think that there is a way for him to be able to have these big creative playmaking angles while also not going in, you know, a little bit too early for the rest of this team. Monkey was really good in this series. It just didn't really matter. Ended up trading his life a lot down the stretch, but for the most part, it was kind of worth it. And then Cube, don't play Aurora, man. Like, it's not your thing. You got blasted on the top side in both Game 2 and Game 3. For WE, I unfortunately feel a lot worse about them than I did going into the split right now, which is never ideal. And for Weibo Gaming, you know, they're exactly what I thought they would be. They're going to be a team that's kind of, you know, until they need to figure it out, and then they'll make Worlds. That's just kind of how this organization works, and so I'm not really expecting anything different out of them now. Then moving on now to day number 4. We're in the back half of the week, although definitely a bit of a different circumstance with how many games there actually are this week. We kick off day 4 with a matchup between LGD Gaming and Invictus Gaming, and IG is going to pick up the 2-0 series win here. They're really going to dominate this matchup, and I don't think I really saw this one coming. I did think IG was better than LGD Gaming. I had them 4th versus 6th in my power rankings, but this was not close. Game 1 was a stomp, like a true mega stomp, and Game 2, while it was a lot closer, mostly because Xiaosu on the top side was actually pretty solid on the Renekton, there was nothing else coming out from any other member of LGD Gaming. They kind of rolled over and died in their first series. Really not what you're looking for. For Invictus, they continue their hot streak with Wei coming in to the jungle, and unfortunately for Jeje, as well as he played, in my opinion, in spring, as unpopular of a take as that has been, I think this job is gone. I think Wei has fully taken the starting jungle role here on Invictus Gaming. Obviously, you never really know what's going to happen moving forward. Wei has shown to be a more limited upside type of jungler, at least from my perspective. This is a guy who I just don't really trust at a top-end level. I know I'm a lot lower on him, though, so, you know, maybe I'm just wrong. I've been wrong on players in the past. I'm certainly not afraid to admit that. Maybe he just comes over here to Invictus and makes the team better. I'm not going to be all that surprised if that's the case, and maybe they just needed a reset in terms of just shot calling. Maybe they needed a different kind of voice in there, because players like Mako and Rookie are playing way better right now than they did at the beginning of the split, and maybe that's just the reset that they needed in order to start getting onto their own page. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Wei is going to be the player who gets player of the series for me. I'm certainly not going to sit here and shit on his gameplay if he's going to play this well. I did the same thing when he was on BLG last year when he joined in the summer split, where I didn't agree with the decision. I thought it was a mistake to let go, or I guess to bench Shun in favor of Wei for BLG, but even so, I was going to compliment Wei when he did play well for BLG. Now, obviously, they ended up going back to Shun, and that gave them a higher upside as a team, but Wei as a player has this floor, has this stability to him that I think a lot of teams really value, and this is the kind of performance you get from that kind of floor. A Trundle that's just going to be able to control a lot of tempo, and a Jarvan that actually can create a lot of action for some more immobile carries, like the Victor and like the Jhin on the other side. So, you know, I like Wei's aggressiveness. I think that there are times where he can be a bit too passive. Again, I've always described Wei as a player who, if you like to watch League of Legends where there isn't a lot of bad plays happening, Wei is going to be a player you really enjoy. But Wei is also not the kind of player that I think creates a ton of great plays for your team. Now, if that floor raises, and that means that Mako and Rookie and the Shy can start creating great plays a little bit more often because you don't have another volatile playmaker like Jeje in the jungle, then I think that could be a positive, because Jeje certainly is more volatile than Wei, but that's kind of the difference in those two players. And again, if Wei ends up being better for this team, at this point, I'm certainly not going to be surprised. We'll just have to see how it keeps going. But great start here. Great week number 1 for IG and for Wei. Rookie as well, with a really nice week number 1, but it's Gala who I think has really taken the spotlight, at least in terms of their wins. I was a big Gala defender in spring as well. I thought he was much better than people gave him credit for. He was probably the 4th or 5th best AD carry, maybe even 3rd if you really want to push him there in terms of his production across the spring split. He never really got credit for it because Mako was so terrible in lane that it was basically unplayable for him to get a lead in the 2v2. And while he is a good late game player, he's not very flashy in terms of how he plays the game. The player I always compare him to the most, which again, if you're a longtime fan, you're probably bored of hearing this comparison, but I always compared him to Gumayushi. I think him and Gumayushi are very similar players in terms of how they play the game, and Gala, when he gets enabled, can look incredible. He can still be a big positive for a team, even if the rest of the team is kind of collapsing, and that's what we've seen from him. I think he can have bad performances as well, but the good ones definitely outweigh the bad. Like I said, Rookie had a great week 1. Mako is looking a lot better here in week 1 than he did in spring. I don't know if that's Wei coming in. I know Mako was like really trying to work with Jeje throughout this year, so whatever the reason, like, Mako has already looked better in week 1 than he ever did in the spring split, and the Shy has definitely been solid on the top side as well. Invictus just look better, and they look more consistent right now than they did at the end of last split. And for LGD Gaming on the other side, this is a pretty bad way to start off summer. Obviously, there are things you can fix, things you can work around, but Pays, very out of character performance from him. He's done of the series, and it's not particularly close. The Sivir, the Varus, both games, quite bad from him. His positioning very poor. His damage output was very low throughout a lot of the series. You kind of just have to throw this out because FaZe has never really played like this throughout his career, and FaZe has honestly been a player that's gotten better over the course of time, not only just in terms of him getting older and obviously, you know, ramping up for both Gen G and JD Gaming, but he was a player who played his best league in summer in the LCK, so I would imagine he's going to be just fine. It's just not really a great start to the split. I think Scout also has his own problems. He is a bit slower as a mid laner. I think that there are some concerns with whether or not that fits with the team construction you have here on JDG, but I'm not willing to completely throw out Scout just yet. I still think he had a couple of good games in the spring split. Shun was definitely not as good as Wei on the other side of this. I think there were good moments, but also some bad ones as well. Definitely going to be monitoring his more Feast or Famine form. Ironically enough, the big positive here is Xiaosu on the top side, who I thought was the best player for JDG in this series. He was really good on the Renekton in game number 2. It just didn't really end up mattering. That is a good sign because this is a player that has shown flashes in the past, and JDG are obviously expecting a lot out of him coming in as their new starting top laner, but it's certainly not the start from a results perspective that they were looking for at the beginning of summer. Hopefully FaZe's form in particular and Shun's form can turn back around. And for Invictus, like I said, if they're just going to be better with Wei, that's pretty massive for this team. They're pushing to get top 2 or top 3, and you know what? In terms of how they're playing right now, who's to say they can't get there? Then moving on to our second series of day number 4, and it's a matchup between LNG Esports and Thunder Talk Gaming, where Thunder Talk are going to be able to pick up the 2-0 win. Not really much to say here other than that LNG really is terrible. They do nothing and lose. Like, that is the takeaway from this series for anybody who might be interested at all in going to watch this. Don't go to watch this. There's nothing to see here other than LNG being absolutely terrible. But for Thunder Talk, it is a nice win. Like, it's good to see that they are living up to kind of the hype of being probably the third best team in Group Nirvana. Obviously, maybe they're better than Edward Gaming. You never really know how things can turn out there. Ninjas and Pyjamas definitely feel like the top tier, at least for now, but Thunder Talk doing what they need to do in order to kind of solidify their spot and potentially get a play-in series to the playoffs once more. So we'll talk about it here. Once again, 1xN is going to be player of the series here for Thunder Talk. You know, I said earlier, I really need to see him be the main character, be the captain of Thunder Talk, really the one player here that has real upside, that can really transform this team from being bad to being okay. I don't think he can ever make them good, but he maybe can make them playable, right? And so far, he's living up to that, which I think is really cool to see. Again, I've never been the biggest fan of 1xN just because I am a bit concerned overall about his, like, playstyle and generally about the upside that brings, but if he's just going to be the best AD carry in Group Nirvana, which is certainly not out of the realm of possibility with the players that are there, like, if he can be better than Leave and better than On, which, again, it's not, you know, guaranteed, but it's certainly possible, then that's good enough for Thunder Talk to be competitive in a lot of these series, and that's exactly what we're seeing here. He's certainly taking advantage of the bad AD carries, first and foremost, which is really something he needs to do. But the Sivir, the Xayah in particular in game number 2, really, really solid from him. Just a great series. He is the carry on this team, and he's living up to it right now. Feather continues to be pretty solid in the support position. We'll get to the LNG bot lane. They were disastrous here, as was basically all of LNG. Shout out Zeka. He's trying his best on the top side of the map to do anything for this roster, but there's just no room for him to operate in any capacity because everybody else really is that bad. But 1xN and Feather definitely out-dueling their counterparts on the other side of this. Hoya had a great series. I think this is the best I've seen him play in quite a while. He had a couple of these in the spring split where it's like, I didn't know you had that in you still. Like, you were a player that I had basically given up on in terms of high-end upside, but on tanks, he can still have some pretty decent performances. I loved him in game 1 and in game 2, so, you know, Hoya going deathless is not a fluke in this series. I think there is something in there that you can bring out. It's just never going to be there consistently. You're never going to get it from a game-to-game basis. Aki was solid, definitely better than Xiao Feng on the other side. Seitab was definitely better than Haichao, which again is never a good sign. If Thunder Talk solo laners are winning, you're doomed. You're gonna lose that series, and so just kind of is what it is. Nice win for Thunder Talk and a bad loss for LNG. I'm giving up. It's over for this team. This team is cooked. They're done. They're dusted. There's nothing else left to talk about. Everything is going wrong for LNG, and there's really no hope for them to be able to fix it, unfortunately for them, unless their players figure it out. They would need a whole new roster. People are suggesting, oh, what if Assume comes in and starts playing AD carry for this team? Would he be better than LP? Absolutely. He is a better player than LP. Do I think that Assume coming into play with Zhuo in the support position to have to play off of Haichao Haichao in the mid lane, to have to play off of Xiaofang in the jungle. Do I think that that is going to make LNG a team that actually can compete? No, I don't think that's going to happen, and I really would be surprised at this point if that ended up changing. Haichao was actually going to get my dud of the series. I know that might not be the most popular opinion because he actually did, play game 1 relatively okay, but that Azir game was so horrific. Like, he genuinely played that so bad that I just can't justify giving it to anyone else. Although, if you did want to give it to LP, it's right there, man. Like, the 80 carry gap in this series was ginormous, but Haichao's going into Satab, and he's getting absolutely obliterated, not only in lane, but out of lane as well on the Azir. I'm done. It's over, man. I'm giving up on Haichao. The Haichao experiment is over. It's not working for me. So, yeah, the gameplay I've seen, I'm out. He's done of the series here for me. But again, LP, Zhuo, they were also terrible in this series. LP in particular is not an LPL caliber AD carry. I think we are learning that. We learned that a long time ago. I was anti-LP when he was actually doing well for LNG. I'm certainly not going to jump on the bandwagon now that he's not playing well and the rest of the team is falling apart. I've never really been a big fan of his gameplay. I thought he was just below average at everything, and that kind of continues to be the case. Zhuo is a player that, again, like, there is promise, there is hope that in the right situation he could be okay, but, at this point in his career, especially with as many chances as he's gotten, I just don't think that's ever going to happen. Zika's the only one on this team even trying to win. I just don't think LNG are very good. There is a bottom 3 in the LPL right now. There might even be worse than that, depending on what we see later on in the week, and LNG are more than a part of that at the moment. And for Thunder Talk, again, they're in the upper echelon of Group Nirvana teams. How much does that matter? Do I think they can make playoffs? I think it's a stretch, right? I don't feel great about that. I think teams like Edward Gaming and Ninjas in Pyjamas just have more upside because they have a better, more complete roster, but who knows, man? We've seen weaker teams than Thunder Talk make the playoffs. Hell, we've seen Thunder Talk make the playoffs, and so anything can really happen, and at least for now, the LPL does kind of feel a little bit open here in the middle. Then moving on now to day number 5, and we kick day 5 off with a matchup that honestly week 1 made me very excited for. Ninjas in Pyjamas taking on Edward Gaming, and Edward Gaming is going to pick up the 2-0 win. This is huge for them. They are playing out of their minds right now in terms of where their form is at, and quite frankly, they have not only exceeded every expectation that we could have possibly had for them, they are looking like a team that's genuinely dangerous. They are for sure a top 8 team in terms of their production right now, and if that's the case, if they're going to be making the playoffs with this exciting of a roster, who knows what could happen. I've already hyped up a couple of players here, but I will continue to sing their praises because Ninjas in Pyjamas, they looked okay to start the split. I know this team is going to take some time to get used to playing with 2 new players, and their strength of schedule, obviously, up until this point has been very easy, but this was their first big challenge, and quite frankly, they failed it. So really intrigued to see where they go from here because this is a team that is definitely attempting to try and make playoffs and, make some noise, but right now, Edward Gaming is the Group Nirvana team to look out for him. A lot of that is the bot lane, man. This bot lane's legit. Like, they are actually figuring things out. Palkia's really good in the support position. He's going to get player of the series once again, especially for a player who doesn't really have a ton of competitive experience. Again, I know we've talked about that pretty extensively with some other players who have been starting in other roles, whether it be IYY coming in for FPX or players like Vampire and Sheer in previous years that have also kind of taken the fast track to the pros because of a necessary, hole being opened up on a specific team, specifically this EDG support position. But Palkia is easily the best of them in terms of what we're seeing from day number 1. This guy actually looks super composed. His macro's really solid. He's always in the right place at the right time. And his playmaking instincts are huge. Like, he's awesome. Like, he's a really fun support to watch. If he's going to be able to keep this up, that's terrifying for the rest of Group Nirvana. He might already be the best support in Group Nirvana, basically from day 1. On is a big part of that. On is doing a great job to capitalize on everything being created by Palkia, but it's the duo in general that's really separating them. Wink did not give them this kind of pressure coming in from the support position, and Wink has been a player that I've liked for quite a while in terms of the tape. That just goes to show how high I view Palkia and how much On has really started to step up his game as well, now that he actually has a lot of avenues to be able to capitalize on the resources created. The Kaisa was awesome in game number 2. Really great stuff. That was a classic LPL Kaisa game from On, which is really cool. Angel goes deathless throughout this series. Angel has started off crazy hot. Angel's already a player that we really trust a lot, and obviously has had a lot of experience, has been to a world finals. Like, we know he can accomplish some things, but if he's going to be that Ninjas in Pyjamas, Angel again, that have that kind of form, that's terrifying. That's the best mid laner in Group Nirvana, even over Doingby, if that's going to be the case. And we kind of saw that here in this series. Don't be sleeping on Xiao Hao on the top side of the map, man. Like, again, I've already gone to bat for him a lot in this video. video, and so if you're watching this segment, you've probably already heard me gush about him, but this guy is incredible, and he always steps up in summer. ZDZ has been playing really well on the top side of the map. It just feels like everything is clicking for Edward Gaming right now, and to me, that's a top 8 team. It might even be better than that, depending on what happens with WE and whether or not they can keep their form up. Hell, JDG didn't look very good in their first series. Edward Gaming has a pathway to being a very interesting roster. Do I think they're going to break through and destroy everybody? No, I think there's still a lot to go, but they've passed every test that they've been given so far, and the roster looks good. And for Ninjas in Pyjamas, this is a concerning loss. Again, I don't want to freak out because you do have new players coming in, and this is really the first actual matchup that you've had to deal with throughout this year, and so maybe it does just take some time for this team to feel more comfortable, but you were really relying on Nio and Niket coming in and, stabilizing this team, being upgrades to those positions. They were the letdowns in this series. They were the problem, 100%. Whoever you want to give dud of the series to out of those two players is kind of up to you. Nio, I think, made some aggressive plays, and that at least gave him some credibility in my eyes, so Niket is going to get my dud of the series, because I think support gap was bigger than jungle gap in this series, but if you wanted to give it to Nio, I'm certainly not going to complain. Both of them were just not good enough here for Ninjas in Pyjamas, and again, if that's going to be the case, that's a nightmare for NIP. These are the players that came in and were supposed to be upgrades to players that just couldn't find their form against good enough talent. Right now, I'm concerned that Nio and Niket aren't going to be good enough against top-tier talent. These are pretty unproven players in terms of actual top-tier contending, and I get it's Group Nirvana, and I get it's early, but they can't play like this. If they're going to play like this, even against EDG, this team's not a playoff team. They're not going to be able to beat teams like WE or JD Gaming to get themselves into playoffs, because, again, Edward Gaming just picked up a win. They're on track to be that number 1 seed out of Group Nirvana. That's super, super big right now with how bad FPX is. To be able to get that matchup against them in a play-in spot to get into playoffs could be huge, and Ninjas in Pyjamas are just not in a great spot. I don't want to take all blame away, though, from Doingby, from Leave. They were not good. They were not good enough in this series. Doingby, in particular, did not play well. Angel completely outplayed him in basically every capacity. Leave was aggressive, at times too aggressive. Solo kill was fine on the top side. Definitely the best player on NIP in this series, but again, if these new recruits, if the players coming in to help solve your issues aren't going to fix the problem, then what are we even doing here on NIP? Are we just going to continue to be like a bottom 5 team in the LPL? Because that's just not what we want to see. And EDG are clearly better than that. They've gotten better over the course of this year. Palkia honestly seems to be an upgrade here in the support position. And now you've unlocked Summer Zhaohao. You've unlocked Summer Angel, Summer On. All of these players are really starting to get back into form. And in that case, who knows, man? Edward Gaming could genuinely be terrifying. Then moving on to our second series of day number 5, and it's the two teams that I would say have the closest name values in the LPL. It's LNG taking on LGD, and LGD is going to pick up the win over LNG in this matchup. Obviously, jokes aside, this matchup was only illuminating in the sense that this was likely for the worst team in the LPL. This is your kind of competition of, okay, who genuinely is worse? Congratulations, LNG. You are the worst team in the LPL as of right now. We get a lot of info in week number 1 and week number 2, and that is unfortunately a takeaway I feel pretty confident having moving into the rest of the split. LGD looked okay in this series. I think that there were some takeaways that were positive, some that were negative. I still don't think this team is all that perfect, but generally they're definitely better than LNG, and Ultra Prime somewhere around here as well. So, congratulations to those 3 teams, but let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series for me is going to go to Savior in the bot lane. I don't think this is a slam dunk by any means. I think that there are a couple of options here if you wanted to go for somebody else, but Savior to me kind of stood out the most in their wins. I think the Zeri game in Game 2 and the Caitlyn in Game 3, I think both of those combined really kind of, pushed it forward. The Zeri in particular, though, in Game 2 is really what Savior is getting Player of the Series for. Completely took over that game. Obviously, if you're going to be playing, Sejuani Yone with Zeri Lulu down in the bot lane, your Zeri needs to perform. That's a big part of the puzzle in terms of how those things go, but Savior still had to go out there and execute, which I think he did at a pretty high level. I'm excited for Savior. I think that there have been some nice developments coming in from him as a player. I think obviously, if you're not familiar, if you're not aware, formerly Xiaoya, the starting AD carry here for LGD, just name swapping over to Savior, but there have been a lot of fun developments here, and he's clearly better than LP, who's the worst AD carry in the league at the current moment, so that's certainly a plus, definitely something you can take away from there, but wasn't the only player to play well. YCX is a playmaker, and honestly, I really like him on Enchanters as well. That's something that I really liked when I was watching the LDL tape coming into the year. You can check out my winter primer video for that kind of analysis, but YCX is a player I'm definitely going to be monitoring. I think the bot lane here is really not all that bad for LGD. Hopefully they can continue to grow. Climber had an incredible game number 3 on the Jarvan. Really was just great setup throughout the entire series on things like Sejuani as well. But it was the Jarvan game that I think really separated him. Xiao Feng on the other side actually played fine. I would say was definitely the best performing member for LNG, outside of maybe Zika on the top side, who I'm going to continue to give a pass to because I just really trust him as a player. But Climber definitely playing a bit better than he did earlier in the week. Sasa continues to be on a really big hot streak right now. I'm really excited to see if Sasa can kind of get some of that like Xiaosu hype arc coming in, where it's just, oh, you know, he looks really good on LGD for a couple splits and then goes to bigger and greener pastures and ends up being a good top laner. I hope Sasa can have that arc because I really do like him as a player. I think he's super aggro and super greedy, which is obviously really good in the top lane, and for the most part he has the mechanics to back it up, which is almost always a plus. XQW still the weak link of this team, but certainly wasn't a problem in this series by any stretch of the imagination. LGD are definitely not bottom 1, I can guarantee that. LNG definitely are, at least for now though. They haven't had a chance to prove that against Ultra Prime just yet. But man, I would have a hard time believing you could put anyone else at number 14 right now. This team is completely collapsing. They have gotten worse and worse and worse, and this is what they are now, as a team that honestly can barely even compete with the bottom tier teams in the LPL. LP is not a tier 1 caliber player. He's going to get dead of the series. This guy just does nothing at an LPL caliber level. He is below average. I would say significantly below average, if not outright bad at almost every part of the game. He's not a good laner. He's not a good team fighter. There's just nothing else to see here. He's just not an LPL caliber AD carry. You know, Photic isn't also, and maybe Photic has higher upsides, but his downsides are just as bad as LP. Like, it's really just up to you to determine where exactly that problem is. You know, they need a new AD carry. That's definitely, to say the least, in terms of, you know, where they're at right now. But Zhuo's not helping things. I don't think he's playing particularly well. Haichao is, again, also not an LPL caliber mid laner in the form that he's in right now. He's getting absolutely toasted by XQW, who I think is kind of unplayable for LGD. Xiao Feng was the only player, like I said, actually making something happen, but all of that was in game number 1 on the Viego. Outside of that, nothing. And even Zika was losing. Like, Sasa was definitely the better top laner in this series. It just, you know, I'm not putting it all on Zika because I think in a different circumstance he would be a better player, but LNG is a disaster. This team has fallen apart in every feasible area, and they are looking like bottom 1 in the LPL. And for LGD, obviously, they're not bottom 1. They're at least competent and playable at this level. How high do I think they can get? Maybe they're the best of the rest right now, which would put them around number 12 or 11 in terms of the rankings. Like, that's probably optimistic in terms of where they're sitting, but at the very least, they're not absolutely at the bottom. Now moving on to day number 6, we're entering our weekend days, which means we're entering our last super day, which means 3 series to cover, and kicking off day number 6 was a matchup between Ultra Prime and Ninjas in Pyjamas, and NIP are going to pick up the win. Honestly, not much to talk about here. This is basically as you would have expected. Between these two teams, NIP is better than Ultra Prime, who's fighting it out to not be the worst in the entire league, and I think they proved that they weren't the worst in the league here with their Game 2 win, where honestly they looked really good. They looked pretty dominant in that Game 2 win. A lot to like about how they ended up playing that game, and there are, you know, a couple of players on this team that I think are worth watching, even if they are inconsistent right now. But for NIP, they're just a little bit better across the board, and they certainly had better execution down the stretch. Public execution, transition into player of the series solo kill on this Ambessa in game number 3. Awesome team fighting from him, like truly elite level team fighting coming in from him down the stretch of this game. Really impressed with his development. I was a big fan of his on EDG. You can go back and check the channel logs on that one. I was hyping him up even when that team was kind of a disaster, at least talking about his upside. I wasn't saying he was a finished product by any means, but I liked him a lot more than other analysts did, and it seems I was kind of right to do so because he's come in here for NIP and looked really good. Looked like a pure upgrade over Shanji, certainly somebody who offers a lot more in team fights and in lane, to be quite frank. Like, he's just a good mechanically talented player that can do a lot of different things, and he was really good in this series. Maybe outside of game 2 on the Yorick not as relevant as maybe he was previously. You know, the Gwen was good, the Ambessa was great, especially in those team fights, but Leave taking a lot of attention, I'll say, on the Smolder in game number 3. Leave was fine. You know, I think Leave is what everyone says Jackie Love is. Like, that's kind of the take I've always had, where Leave is a player that will make a back-breaking, game-breaking error at some point in the back half of the game, and you just kind of have to deal with it because his positioning is just not very good. In team fights, out of team fights, in skirmishes, like, Jackie Love makes those plays as well. I want to be clear on that. But Leave has crazy upside. He's ridiculously mechanically talented. He just can't find any sort of consistency throughout a lot of these games. He's going to die a lot more than he needs to in these instances, but when it works, when he gets to play Smolder and take over one fight, you know, it looks incredible, and the Smolder was unstoppable by the end of this game, whether Leave wanted it to be or not. Nio had a nice bounce back here. He was definitely better than he was in the previous series. Same with Niket down in the support position. Much easier to go into Junhao and Xiaoxia than it is to go into Xiaohao and Palkia at this point, who are incredible players, as we have learned. But Doingbi looking a lot more, Doingbi-esque. Overall, Ninjas in Pyjamas getting back on track, even if they really should not have lost game number 2 in the way that they did. Really bad performance from them. Hopefully they can figure out whatever is going on with them right now. And for Ultra Prime on the other side, Echo Mid in game number 2, that's pretty cool. Unfortunately, Saber's still gonna get dead of the series, because as much as I do like the Echo Mid, and it did kind of work out, actually really worked out, quite frankly, in game number 2. Corki was bad in game 3, the Rise was bad in game 1. If you're gonna be bad in your 2 losses, it kind of negates the fact that you were good in your 1 win. I think the only player that doesn't apply to is Baya here, who I think had a couple of mistakes throughout the rest of the series, but was good enough in game 2 on the Varus for me to kind of avoid giving him dead of the series. The one player you can point out in a positive light here, I would say, for Ultra Prime, Jung on the top side, who actually played pretty well in this series. The Sion game in game 2 was huge, played those team fights really well, and the Cassante game in game 3 was actually pretty good as well. It just didn't really end up mattering. Solo Kill hit a bigger ultimate down the stretch, and so we ended up coming out on top. But Jung, a player who I've been waiting to kind of hype up on this channel, he showed so much in the PCS from a mechanical perspective. He's not really been able to translate that at all to the LPL, but this was the solo kill king going up against solo kill, ironically enough, in this matchup in the PCS. Again, it's just not really worked out so far in 2025. There are glimpses of a good player in there. I just don't know if we're going to get that. But Saber's dead of the series. Xiaoxia is not a very good support. I think we are learning that he continues to really lack in tempo and pressure, especially in the 2v2. We'll see how things end up developing for Ultra Prime, but I don't really have high expectations for them. And again, it's a nice win for NIP, but we've seen a couple of these throughout this series so far, throughout this week so far. It's all well and good to be able to beat up on Ultra Prime in these bad teams. Losing to a team like LGD Gaming is still concerning. They want to be number 1 in Group Nirvana, not just another good team. Then moving on to our second series of day number 6. And you know what? We had to wait a little bit of time. We had to get these teams back from their EWC international ventures, but the top 2 teams are alive. They are well, and we get a matchup of them here. Anyone's Legend taking on Bilibili Gaming, a rematch of the finals. And this time it's Bilibili Gaming coming out on top with their new jungler Shadow taking over and putting them over the top, really being awesome in this series. And BLG just generally looking very good in this series. The mid-jungle duo of Shadow and Knight looked incredible in terms of how they linked up and just how much pressure they were able to put on. Now, there are some caveats to take away from this. First and foremost, BLG, I believe, has been in China a lot longer than Anyone's Legend has been. AL ends up going to the finals of that tournament in EWC in Riyadh. And ends up going pretty far, has to stay there quite a long time. You guys know my feelings on EWC. It's a pointless tournament that has no real bearing on anything throughout the rest of the year, as we saw last year with Top Esports making the final and obviously T1 winning and, all of that stuff, right? Like, it didn't matter, and every team who played at that tournament came back worse domestically than they were playing at EWC, because it's a huge break right in the middle of the beginning of the split. But at the same time, I don't want to sit here and say that, AL's problems are exclusively the fact that they're coming back from the EWC. I just think it's a pretty darn good excuse for why this team looks so shaky, especially going late into these series. So let's talk about it. Shadow, the new jungler for Bilibili Gaming, coming in to replace Beichuan, who replaced Wei, who replaced Shun. It just seems to be a carousel in the jungle position right now. It feels very funny to talk about, but Shadow comes in and looks great in the first series. Do I think this is a huge upgrade for BLG? Not really. I think Beichuan, Shadow, they're kind of around the same skill level. I think they're different players. Shadow much more built in the Shun mold in terms of how he wants to play the game, does want to be a facilitator, but in a more aggressive way, right? Actively wants to be a big team fight initiator, wants to try and push the game forward for the rest of his team, doesn't just want to be kind of a macro bot or an engage bot like what Beichuan was for this team. And that was a bit of a problem because mechanically speaking, we all kind of know that Beichuan's just not really a top tier player. Like, that's just, it is what it is. It's always been his weakness as a jungler. So Shadow coming in who has better mechanics than Beichuan, even if I don't think he's quite the same kind of macro oriented player that Beichuan is, maybe it is an upgrade for BLG. They're literally throwing everything at the wall that they can right now to find anybody who can play that position and make this team better. Hopefully it will be Shadow, because I just can't take any more roster changes for BLG. But again, he looked great here in his debut, specifically on the Sejuani in game 3, but great enabling on the Wukong in game number 2 as well. Were there some problems at the beginning of this series? Maybe, but I also think he was the best player on BLG in game 1 when he was on the Trundle. Overall, I just think he played great. Not only was he kind of the main focus for BLG in this series, but I think he lived up to it in terms of the performance that he actively offered. Of course, it wasn't just him, though. Knight had an incredible series, as he almost always does. If you have one thing you can rely on for BLG, regardless of the form of the bot lane, which I think is very questionable right now, Bin has been up and down over the course of this year, you can trust that Knight is going to be good, that he's going to be able to figure things out. I still believe he is the best player in the LPL, and I don't think it's particularly close. Tarzan is as close as we've gotten in quite a long time to someone dethroning Knight, but to me, Knight has kind of proven himself as the #1 guy, and if you wanted to give him player of the series, that's on you, man. I'm certainly not going to take anything away from your thoughts on Knight in that regard. He was incredible on the Talia in game number 2, and he was awesome on the Victor in game number 3 as well. Ended up leading the team in damage in both of those games, I believe, over Xayah and Lucian. Not always the easiest task, but, you know, Shadow, Knight, if they're going to pair up and be a really strong mid-jungle duo, obviously that's going to increase BLG's ability to play against top-tier teams. The question is that going to be something that can be consistent throughout an entire split? Because that's been the problem for BLG. It's not these off games. That you can have great games with Wei, or with Beichuan, or with Shun. Like, you had great moments with them, but can you get an entire great split? Can you get a great team out of that coordination? That remains to be seen. I think the rest of this team was fine. Elk had a pretty good series, I think, all things considered. On has been out of form ever since MSI. I really don't know what happened, because I thought he was pretty good in the playoffs for BLG, but he got to MSI. He was terrible at that tournament, and honestly wasn't very good at EWC either, and now he looks pretty terrible here. Like, I don't know, man. It's just not... something's going on with On. Hopefully he can figure it out. Bin in the top lane has not really been the same kind of version of himself. This has been a much weaker year than he had the last 2 years. Much more familiar to people who maybe watched him in 2021 or 2022. That's kind of the version of Bin that we're getting right now. Again, hopefully he can figure things out, because it's still so in flux for him right now. But Shadow looked pretty good in his debut, and for anyone's legend, not really the way you wanted to kick off your split. Obviously, again, there's a ton of excuses for this loss. I'm not going to freak out or panic for any stretch of the imagination, because, again, anything can happen when you have to take gigantic plane flights all across the world. You go from Vancouver to Riyadh to China. Like, these guys are exhausted. There's nothing else left to say, but it is worth noting that BLG made the same trip, and they were able to kind of pick it up a little bit quicker. Tarzan's gonna get dead of the series for me. Shadow just out-jungled him in the back half of the series. I don't even think that's really all that debatable. The Xin Zhao, the Jarvan, neither really ended up working out for Tarzan. I think he'll be fine. Again, I'm not worried about Tarzan. He even has games like this when he's in form. It's just, hopefully he does end up turning it around. Flandra would have gotten done of the series if he wasn't so good in game number 1 when they ended up winning. He dominates on that Rumble in that first game, ends up being the biggest piece for the team in their victory, and then completely sprints it in games 2 and 3. He was horrible. Easily the worst player on AL in the second and third games. But again, he was too good in game 1 for me to give him dud of the series. He essentially won them that first game, so Tarzan ends up with the blame here. Shanks, Hope, KL, they were generally fine. There were moments where they looked like they could play the game, but AL was so far behind in tempo due to BLG in this series that it never really felt like these players could actually play the game. It felt like they were always behind the 8 ball in terms of how things were happening. So I trust that AL will be able to figure it out, that they'll be able to turn things around, but at least for now, not a great look in terms of actual gameplay. BLG was just better here today, and hopefully that's good for BLG and not bad for AL. I believe that is the case. I think BLG is going to continue to be solid, and they'll be better than people's expectations of them, and AL will be able to rebound. So far, I'm not going to take too much into both of these teams coming right back here to China. Then moving on to our third series of day number 6, and it was a matchup between JD Gaming and Team WE, and JDG are going to pick up the 2-1 series win, so even with a little rocky start, we'll say, for JDG in their first series, they're able to bounce back and take down a WE team that unfortunately looks like they've completely gone back to what they were before they ended up breaking out. Really not an ideal set of circumstances for them, because I think a lot of people were really hopeful that they were going to be able to keep that form up. It's just not happening right now. JDG able to limp out of this one with a victory, although I will say they were better in their 2 wins. Game 1 was pretty clean. Game 3, more back and forth than games 1 and 2, but certainly still clean enough for JD Gaming. So let's talk about it. Xiaosu is going to get my player of the series here on the top side. He's really stepping up right now. I know it's only been 2 series. I don't want to freak out or overreact into a player looking really good at the start of a split, but this is somebody who we've been waiting to break out for quite a long time on multiple different teams, and it just has never felt like it's going to happen. In fact, I've been getting less and less optimistic that it's possible over the course of the past few years, as you will have followed on this channel. I've covered his entire LPL career throughout my channel's history. So you'll see kind of the progression of me being like, oh, this guy's the next great LPL top lane prospect. Really excited to see him into, okay, you know, maybe the leap didn't happen in year 2, but he's still kind of on bad teams, into, okay, the leap is still not happening. You know, he's year 3. Even though he's on bad teams, you're kind of hoping to see some sort of improvement. He finally gets picked up by a good team, regardless of the fact that he's really not performing all that well on teams like RNG. And you know what? I guess it took that to actually figure it out, because this Crocodile was gigantic in game 3. And you know what? This isn't the first time that he's dominated on Renekton this week already. I'm really excited to see if that's going to be something that lasts with other champions moving forward, but at least for now, you got to have at least one champ you can pop off on, and right now that is Renekton for Xiaosu. So excited to see that moving forward. Again, hopefully he's going to be able to keep that form up. He was way better than Cube in this matchup, and he is the best player on JD Gaming through their first 2 series. Scout was way better than he's getting credit for in this series. I know people are kind of clowning on the fact that he got double player of the game for these 2, and I agree. He's not player of the game in game 3. I don't even think that's really all that debatable, but he definitely was in game number 1 on the Talia, and he still was really good on the Orianna in game number 3. I don't want people sitting here saying that Scout has no good games. I think that's a pretty ridiculous thing to say. He can still perform really well in big moments. He's just not a very flashy player anymore. And if he's going to be your number 3 option, I honestly think that's a pretty good place to be. He might even be number 4 behind Shun if you really want to give him a lot of credit in that regard in terms of where the resources are going. So overall, I feel pretty good about where Scout is at. Pays had a really nice bounce back, was definitely not the Pays we remember in that first series. It's really nice, and I'm glad to see him be able to step up, even with Taeyun also playing a little bit better for WE. On the other side, Shun was fine. Wink had a couple of moments still. I'm kind of waiting for him to settle in the support position. He still is over eager. That game 2 on the Leona was just very, very bad from him. But again, JDG should still be able to figure things out, and they should be able to push forward. And for WE on the other side, like, it is kind of panic mode in terms of what the expectations were. 0-3 is a really bad place to start a split. It's really not an ideal, like, circumstance. I think there are good performances here. Taeyun was better in this series than he was earlier on in the week. I think Monkey was, you know, fine, generally speaking. He's been the one player that I've not been, like, panicking about in terms of how the performances are going, but everybody else, man, they just have some really bad moments, all things considered. Cube is the obvious choice for dead of the series here. Never really was able to go up against Xiaosu and actually, like, compete with him in terms of how things were going in lane. He was, like, clearly the weaker of these 2 top laners. Not that that should be entirely surprising, purely from a mechanical perspective, but even getting Cube onto things like Cassante in game number 3 was not working out. The Rumble in game 1 also quite poor. Cube has been a liability for WE so far at the start of this split. Again, not that that should be surprising, just that it's worth pointing out. Karis as well, I just don't have confidence in him. He's really good in the mid game of generating resources, and boy does he do absolutely nothing with them every single game. It's really just, like, clinical at this point, the fact that he's going to be either up in gold or, like, equal in gold even if his team is losing, and it's never going to show on tape. He's going to use that gold to do absolutely nothing the rest of the game. Not ideal. Vampire is just playing way too fast. He's not on the same page as everybody else on this team. I think this was probably the least egregious version of that, but that was really something I noticed that was, you know, kind of like a core point for him throughout the first 3 series that they played this week, where it's just, you got to slow down at least a little bit. This was something that was a big problem for him on EDG and IG last year. I was hoping that he had been able to kind of get that out of his system. Not necessarily sure that has happened after watching what has happened here. So again, overall for WE, I'm not super concerned that this team is going to be terrible in the sense that, you know, even if they go, like, you know, 2 wins in Group Ascend, like 3-4 wins, whatever, in Group Ascend, I still think there's a chance they end up making playoffs, just because I'm not, you know, in love with the teams in Group Nirvana, but especially if EDG, NIP, you know, Thunder Talk, if all of them are going to be relevant, WE might not have an easy pathway to getting top 8 once again, and this is coming off of a top 4 finish in the playoffs in the spring split. Certainly not ideal. And for JD Gaming, it's obviously a nice win, but we need to see this happen against teams that aren't quite in disarray like WE is right now. I still have major concerns about what JDG is moving forward, but they might have actually found kind of a sleeper, a sneaky great pickup in the top lane. But that's going to bring us to our 7th and final day of action here in the LPL in week number 2. We're getting through everything here today, and kicking off day 7 was a matchup between Bilibili Gaming and FunPlus Phoenix, and BLG is going to pick up yet another win, this time 2-0. You know, this might be best versus worst in Group Ascend. Like, is it crazy to say that with how BLG started off this split? Obviously, you don't want to freak out too much over AL's loss because, you know, again, coming back from EWC, but BLG have not had that same problem. They have looked great coming back back here, and a lot of it is their jungler, their new jungler, and I promise I won't get randomly excited about a new BLG jungler until they prove they can do it over the span of like a large period of time. But Shadow is playing really, really well right now for BLG, and he is a player who has shown a lot of promise in the past. I'm hopeful that this is something that can stick, not only for BLG, but for Shadow, who I think has deserved better teammates for a very long time. And for FPX, his former org on the other side, boy, do they miss him in terms of how things are going right now. This team is a disaster. They are clearly worse than most teams in Group Nirvana. Not all teams in Group Nirvana, but quite a lot of them. I will talk about a potential roster change that is coming in very shortly, but there are still some question marks around whether or not that's going to happen as quickly as people think it will. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Shadow is player of the series here. He continues to really dominate. This was his series to take over. Like, Elk played great, and I want to give him credit for Game 2 in particular on Lucian. I think he's a reasonable player of the series here. Same thing with Bin on the top side, who absolutely decimated Sheer in terms of how this matchup ended up going. But Shadow really was kind of the driving force, I would say, overall for BLG, and he did it in both games. The Trundle in game 1 was definitely main character, syndrome worthy. Like, the Trundle was just everywhere, and he was really awesome on the Trundle against AL as well, even in their loss in game number 1. I'm excited to see that that's a champion that's really been a positive, not only for Shadow, but for BLG, because I think it fits their playstyle really well. But the Xin Zhao in game 2, he's taken away every camp. He's fighting at every possible, instance. Like, it's the aggressive style that we saw out of Shun that they didn't really have in Wei or Beichuan, where they weren't really opening up the map in the same kind of way. Shadow is really kind of putting that into action once again here for BLG, and I think it's making everyone around him better as well. So credit to Shadow. IYY, obviously, on the other side of this is not even close to being good enough to match him in terms of how things are going. This was a gigantic jungle canyon, which we will talk about, but Shadow deserves the credit for being the one to push the tempo and create that canyon that ended up forming. Obviously, the rest of this team was phenomenal. Bin goes 7-1-28 in 2 games against Sheer. That's pretty fantastic. Sheer got decimated on the top side, and it's good to see that Bin feels a lot more comfortable, at least in this series. Elk was incredible here, probably the second best player on the team in this series, specifically for that Lucian game in game number 2. I was really low on Elk's spring split, much lower than other people were, especially the first half of that split, where things were just not going his way. The bot lane in general was not really clicking in a lot of ways. Hopefully, Elk is getting back on track. Same thing for On. He was bad at MSI. He was good before that. Had some questionable moments in the regular season as well. If you can get a full good split out of Elk, On, and Bin, BLG's the best team in the LPL. Like, full stop, end of story. Like, I don't care who the jungler is for that team. If Bin is the best top laner, if Elk and On are the best bot lane, Knight's going to be in the conversation for the best player in the entire league. It does not matter who's in the jungle position for that team. They're going to be able to figure it out. And if Shadow's aggressive mentality and his aggressive playstyle is going to be the conduit that helps get them there, that's what really matters in the end. And then for FPX on the other side, IYY is dud of the series, although it's not an easy decision. Sheer got blasted on the top side. Jway probably had his worst series in a very long time. Like, this was just not close. FPX looked like they were 8,000 leagues out of where BLG is in terms of their production and their performance, but I'm giving it to IYY, not only because Shadow was so good, but because he was completely taken out of these games. He wasn't able to get any farm. He wasn't able to involve himself in any sort of action on Jarvan, on Wukong. It didn't matter. He was completely useless this series. Like, he was the least relevant player. I think that is an entirely fair thing to say. But if you did want to give it to Sheer for getting blasted on the top side and, quite frankly, having kind of a bad week number 1, I think that's fair. Jway, I think, wasn't particularly good for this team. He was in their first matchup, but outside of that, after week number 1, he wasn't very good in week number 2. I'll definitely say that. Like, Jway just has not looked good so far. Jiachi, I think, has something in there. Like, Jiachi, I think, can play. Care, I think, is obviously below average. He's matched up well into Knight. Historically speaking, but that was not the case here. FPX is just not very good. Like, this is a bottom 4 team in the LPL, I think, at absolute best at the current moment. They're not better than the top 3 in Group Nirvana. I can promise that. Now, I did say they are considering a roster change. It has been reported that Milky Way might be returning here as the starting jungler. If that's the case, their floor does go up. Their ceiling certainly goes up. But let's not pretend like Milky Way is the most consistent player in the universe. He had his own problems on RNG, where he was not very good throughout basically the entire beginning part of this year. And we did see that Milky Way kind of got figured out in the playoffs last year, and ever since then, he's not been nearly as effective as a player in terms of his playstyle and his champion pool. He reminds me so much of Bo as a jungler that if he comes back and is just kind of below average, I'm not going to be shocked if he comes back and is an MVP candidate. That's also kind of within the realm of possibilities for a player as talented as he is, mechanically speaking. It definitely makes them better, because IYY is not playable in the jungle, and it would give them an actual starting 5 that could compete in Group Ascend, but I certainly don't think it's guaranteed to make them like a contender contender immediately or to take them out of the basement of Group Ascend. Again, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but for BLG, they are clearly at the top of the standings right now. This team looks like it's firing on all cylinders. I just don't want to get baited into yet another year where BLG brings in a new jungler and everything looks good and then it all falls apart again. I think this could be the time for everything to click, but only time will tell on that. But that's going to bring us to our final series of the week, almost 2 hours into this video. I do appreciate you guys sticking with me through this. This has been, you know, a long one. Hopefully we don't get another super long one like this for the LPL, at least for the short term. 2 weeks getting covered in one video is quite a lot, but ending our week number 2 coverage, it was Weibo Gaming taking on Anyone's Legend, and we got a good one to end the week on because Weibo Gaming is going to pick up the 2-1 series win, and honestly, Weibo looked awesome in week number 1. I think it's fair to say that this team should be looking incredible. They just kind of threw away that series against Top Esports and weren't quite able to recover. If Light was just a little bit better in that series, perhaps Weibo is looking at an incredible start, being kind of viewed as one of the best teams in the LPL. But as we know, the moment Weibo starts getting viewed positively, they plummet back down to earth, so maybe it's better off that they end up being a bit more inconsistent. For AL on the other side, again, 2 back-to-back days of games like BLG, it hasn't affected them clearly, so maybe my point is a bit moot, but I'm going to give them a bit of a pass. Give them some time to rest. Give them some time to be able to get their bearings back under home soil, and maybe they'll be able to figure things out, because at least for now, I'm not going to freak out about a team that had to come back immediately from 2 international tournaments to play 2 of the best teams in the LPL. It just kind of is what it is. But for Weibo Gaming, Xiaohu's player of the series, and man, this guy's good. Like, I'm tired of pretending like this guy's not good at League of Legends. There has been stretches of time where he's been terrible. Go look at especially like the beginning of summer and parts of spring of last year, 2024, where things were kind of a disaster, but he really picked things up in Group Ascend last year, where he really got his team on track, was very good at the World Championships, and generally has exclusively been a positive. He made World Finals in 2023. Why are people forgetting this? This Weibo Gaming team was super consistent at Worlds that year, and he was a big reason why they were consistent. The Shy was getting a lot of credit, and I think Light and Crisp did a lot for that team as well. But Xiaohu was really good at that tournament, and I think there was a lot to like about it. This guy is just good at most things. Again, it did kind of encourage me that there was a thread on Twitter over the past couple of days that was like, who's the most underrated League player of all time? And a lot of the responses were Xiaohu. Like, yes, like, absolutely. This is one of the best League players of all time, and he never gets put in that conversation. He's still playing at a pretty high level, and again, with mid lane being kind of up for grabs outside of Shanks and Knight at this level, and even Shanks, like, Xiaohu is better than him in this series. Like, who's to say he's not a top 3 mid laner in the LPL right now? I think that that's a fair thing to at least bring up, but he's certainly not the only one on this team that's performing well. It feels like everything is kind of working a little bit better with Crisp back in the action. You know, I'm not saying it's entirely him that's creating things, but the aggressiveness of this team has increased by quite a lot. With Erha and with Hong earlier on this year, it never really felt like they were able to grasp a lot of those aggressive tendencies that made players like Tien and Xiaohu so good. But with Crisp back in, I think as a primary playmaker for this team, things have opened up a lot more. And yeah, he's still dying a lot, but you know what? It is kind of worth it, and overall he was definitely the better support in this series. Tien had a great game number 3 on the Nocturne, just didn't really end up working out outside of that, obviously. Breathe was solid enough. I think that there were some pluses and minuses, but he answered the top lane Smolder pretty well in game number 3. Even Light is starting to find his own form. I've been very critical of Light throughout a lot of this year, but I think he's been very good throughout the back half of this week. Now, if he could only clean up some of the mistakes that he was making at the start of the week, again, maybe this team is undefeated, but, you know, we can't change the past. We can only talk about the future, and at least for now, Weibo Gaming looking very good in AL, you know, Game 1 merchants, all of this stuff. You can kind of mention some things. I'm not worried about this team. Maybe I'm too optimistic. Maybe I'm too, like, excuses oriented, but I'm just not going to panic over a team, you know, coming back from some major international tournaments, having to face 2 of the best teams in the world and immediately losing. Like, it is what it is, right? Not everyone can be Gen G and be perfect, right? It's the way things go. I will say Tarzan in particular was awful during this stretch. He's once again going to get dud of the series. That's 2 back-to-back dud of the series for him. Hopefully he's going to be able to rebound. Not going to do very well for his point total throughout the rest of the split. It is going to be a little bit of a detriment in terms of maybe some award voting at the end of the split. I know it's crazy to talk about that already, but when you have 2 dud of the series to kick things off, it's not ideal. But the Jarvan Bard combo at times looked like it was going to work. At times he was way too far forward, way too deep to be able to capitalize, and that's not ideal. The Maokai, I think, also had its own sets of problems. in game number 2. I think the Trundle was very good in game number 1, but game 1 was really all about getting Hope on this Corki super fed, and Hope had a great series. I don't want to take anything away from Hope. He was the best player for AL here. It just didn't really end up mattering. Flandra was a little bit overeager. I think Shanks had a couple of moments that weren't great. KL had a couple of moments that weren't great. Again, I don't want to talk too much about AL's form, because I don't think it's all that relevant right now. I think it's all about what they turn into. Now, week 3 is going to be a very big week for AL. If they end up really faltering and not responding or rebounding well, yeah, I'm going to start to get concerned and start to freak out a bit about what their, potential is going to look like moving forward, with other teams potentially making increases. But for now, as long as AL is who we think they are going forward, then they should be fine. And for Weibo, I said in my power rankings, I'm like, man, I really wanted to make this team top 4 over Invictus, and I just didn't have the gall to pull the trigger. Well, it's a pretty big conversation right now. I think top 5 all looked really good across this week, with the exception of anyone's legend, ironically enough. But, Weibo is a team I really believe in, and if this team ends up making Worlds and making an impact throughout the rest of the year, certainly I'm not going to be surprised. All right, but that is going to do it for my LPL Week 1 and Week 2 overview and analysis video in the summer split. Here up on the screen, the updated standings after the first 2 weeks. Obviously, a lot happened. We went over 20 best of 3s across this entire video, so quite a few things to discuss. Every team is going to be sorted in Group Ascend and Group Nirvana, not only by their series score, but by their game score as well, their plus minus, and so we actually don't have any ties, which is very rare for the end of the first couple of weeks, but we've already had so many games played that we're at the point that ties are non-existent. Of course, you can see my personal power ranking for every single one of these teams in the first column to the right. Change is going to be how that has changed from my preseason analysis to now. So before week 1 to the end of week 2, we can go over risers and fallers, but I think most notably, no changes in the top 6. Honestly, I think I nailed it in terms of just analysis and power rankings at the start of the split. Anyone's legend has looked not very good so far, but I imagine they're going to be able to bounce back. I'm giving them grace because they are coming off of an international, and they probably need some time to feel a bit more comfortable, but everything else basically going exactly as planned. BLG is clearly number 2. Top Esports go undefeated are at number 3. Invictus looked pretty good at number 4. Maybe you could swap them and Weibo, but I feel pretty good about Weibo being at number 5 for now. And JDG kind of looking like the worst of the top tier teams, at least out of the top 6. But it's everywhere else where changes start to happen, because coming in at number 7, it's not a Group Ascend team, it's LGD Gaming jumping all the way up to number 7 in my power rankings. I really do think they're that good. I feel pretty confident in saying that they are a top 7 team right now, with all of the other teams kind of around that area showing a lot of questionable things in the first couple of weeks. So EDG's jumping all the way up to number 7. WE moves down to number 8. Those are my projected playoff teams right now, but right on the heels, right on the tail of WE, I have Ninjas and Pyjamas at number 9. Thunder Talk will be staying at number 10, or I guess moving down 1 spot to number 10. They are still kind of within this cluster, though. And then starting off like a new tier, I still have FPX. I actually have them moving up 1 because I trust that Milky Way is going to make them better. How much better? I don't know just yet. So they're moving up to number 11, but I still don't really believe in this team a lot. Remember, I ranked them originally without Jue in the support position as well. Plus Milky Way, plus Jue. They still are a decently competitive team, but I don't think they're top 10 at the moment. Maybe I end up getting proven wrong there, but, I think they're better than the bottom 3 and not much else. LGD is going to move up to number 12 with their victory over LNG, and then Ultra Prime and LNG are obviously at the bottom, but LNG takes that spot by themselves with just how bad their first couple games were. Let me know what you agree with or disagree with down in the comment section below. I'm curious to know where you guys think I'm too high or too low on any of these teams. Always curious to hear your feedback in that department, but let's go ahead and move on to my player of the week and my dud of the week here for weeks 1 and 2 combined. Player of the week should be pretty obvious, all things considered. It's going to Jackie Love, the AD carry for Top Esports. He was the best player in the LPL to start off this split. I don't even think it's really all that debatable. The 3 series he ended up playing, he was a massive influence in all 3 of them. The Xayah against Invictus was ginormous in game number 1. The Kalista ends up picking up that Kalista win against Weibo in game 3. And even the Sivir game, either game really in the FPX series, was really solid. The Lucian as well in that series. Jackie Love just looking incredible throughout the beginning part of this split. I'm hopeful that he's going to be able to keep it up, and honestly, I'd be more shocked if he didn't. Him and Hong look incredible as a duo, but my honorable mentions, very difficult to narrow it down with so many good performers this week. I ended up going with Xiaohu, the mid laner, obviously, for Weibo Gaming. What an incredible start to this split he is having. Hopefully, he's going to be able to keep it up. And then Palkia, the support for LGD Gaming. How could I not give him an honorable mention for Player of the Week? He was the driving force, in my opinion, for an EDG team that went 3-0. I know it's against worse competition, but I have to give him at least a little bit of a shout out. Nio was obviously in contention contention for this as well for NIP, but I felt a little bit worse about that after the EDG series. And then Shadow was also in contention for Bilibili Gaming, but I settled on these 3. And then dud of the week, this one was not difficult. This one was very easy for me to pick. It's Haichao, the mid laner for LNG. I'm completely giving up on Haichao. He was miserable in the first couple of series here. If he doesn't turn around his form, he probably needs to be replaced, like, soon. Even his teammate LP could probably be in this conversation with just how bad he was throughout the back half of this split, or I guess the back half of this week. But Haichao definitely kind of takes the cake in terms of bad performances. So at least in the combined weeks 1 and 2, Haichao is dud of the week and Jackie Love is player of the week. But that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we're covering every single LPL series. If this video is not an example of that, I don't know what will be. Of course, I'm also going to be on cast tonight. You know, pray for my voice. It should be fine, but I will be on cast tonight covering the 2 series for LPL English, and I will be doing that most of the rest of the split as well, so tune into that. Links in the description, but stick around. We're going to be doing LPL weekly recaps. We do it for LTA, LEC, LCK, NACL in North America as well. So if you want a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.